There is a field in Normandy, near a town called Carentan, where the grass grows over metal now. If you were to walk it on a morning in May, the kind of morning with mist still clinging to the earth and dew settling on every blade, you would feel the ground beneath your feet shift slightly, not from the movement of soil, but from the presence of something buried. Unexploded ordnance, shell casings, the physical memory of a doctrine that chose to spend steel instead of flesh, and in doing so, altered forever how a nation waged war. It is a curious fact, one that military historians often whisper between the lines of larger narratives, that on June 19, 1944, 13 days after the Normandy landings, the United States Army fired more rounds of artillery in a single day than the entire Union Army fired during the entire American Civil War. Not more tonnage, more individual rounds. The cumulative thunder of that mathematics, when you sit with it, begins to suggest something profound. Somewhere between the beaches and the hedgerows, American warfare had transformed into something fundamentally different from what any previous generation had imagined. The transformation was not accidental. It was not, as some might assume, simply the result of having more factories and more resources than other nations. It was, instead, a choice, a deliberate philosophy woven into the structure of American military doctrine before the first shot was even fired on American soil in this war. And that choice would echo across 70 years of conflict, shaping how wars would be fought, how casualties would be counted, and what it might mean to go to war as an industrial nation rather than as a collection of men. If you have ever wondered why American soldiers survived the Second World War at rates that sometimes astonished even the generals who sent them into battle, if you have ever asked yourself how a nation could wage total war and still bring home more of its young men alive than the mathematics of industrial combat seem to allow, then this is the story you have been waiting for, even if you did not know to ask it. If you would like to journey through the quiet revolution of firepower doctrine with us, through the mathematics of mercy and the strange alchemy of turning abundance into survival, I invite you to subscribe to this series. We will move through the history deliberately, the way artillery spotters once moved through their calculations, checking and rechecking each figure because the result mattered in blood and breath. Now, imagine yourself standing in that field as the sun rises over Normandy. The mist has not yet burned away. Your boots are wet from the dew. Around you, the gentle undulations of the ground tell a story if you know how to read it. The scar of a shell crater here, the raised berm of an anti-tank ditch there, a small depression where men once sheltered from the rain and the sound. The silence is profound. It is the silence that comes only after terrible noise has stopped. The silence of aftermath. If you walk this ground on a clear morning, you might notice something else. The absence of what you might expect to find. The grass does not seem disturbed by mass graves. There are no monuments to fields soaked in blood, no markers for waves of men thrown at fortifications until the fortifications broke. Instead, what you find are the traces of a different kind of violence. The violence of precision, of distance, of metal meeting earth again and again until an enemy position became untenable, and the men defending it had no choice but to withdraw or surrender. This was the American way by 1944, and it had not always been so. There was a time, not so very long before this, when American soldiers died in patterns that looked almost European in their casualty ratios. There was the wilderness, there was Cold Harbor, there was the Somme and Verdun and Passchendaele, where the mathematics of manpower had been brutally, repeatedly tested, and humanity had lost every time. But between those old wars and this new one, something had changed in the American imagination. Something had shifted in the minds of the men who planned battles. Picture it differently for a moment. Not the silent field in dawn light, but the consciousness of an American officer in 1919, standing among the graves of Europe. Picture a captain named Dwight Eisenhower, or a young major named Omar Bradley, walking through the trenches that had been abandoned only months before. The mud is beginning to harden. The smell is still there, underneath the rain. And what they are seeing, really seeing, not in photographs or dispatches, but in the physical reality of wire and craters and the rust-stained edges of tin, is the cost of mass assault against prepared positions. It is a cost measured not in dollars or ammunition, but in the lives of men who had no real choice. How many of those men, they might have asked each other, in the privacy of officers' quarters, could have been spared if the artillery had been used differently, if the artillery had been used more? If, instead of asking infantry to assault fortified positions with bayonets and courage, you simply ensured that the fortifications had been pulverized into submission before a single soldier stepped forward. If you traded the infinite and precious resource of American lives for the abundant resource of American industry. These were not abstract questions. These were the meditations of professional soldiers, watching the sun set over European mud, carrying the weight of decisions that had already been made and could not be unmade. And they returned to America changed. They returned carrying a conviction that would grow, quietly at first, through the lean years of the 1920s and 1930s, until it became doctrine. A doctrine that said, in essence, let the machines do the work that machines could do, and let the men do what only men could do. The field in Normandy holds that doctrine in every crater, every spent shell casing, every piece of shrapnel that worked its way into the soil, and as you stand there, in that imagined dawn, feeling the dew on your skin and the slight give of earth beneath your feet, you might begin to understand something about how America would wage this war, and why. You might begin to sense the shape of a great conversation that was about to unfold, a conversation between an old way of making war and a new way, between blood and steel, between the values of a young nation and the mathematics of industrial power. The mist is lifting now, in that field. The sun is higher, and if you listen carefully, very carefully, you might almost hear the echo of what comes next. Not the thunder of the guns themselves, but the quieter, steadier sound of a nation beginning to understand what it possessed, and what it was willing to spend to protect the men it sent into harm's way. There is a question that quietly haunts the morning light across those ancient battlefields, one that echoes through the decades with a particular kind of weight. It is this: why did the American army, when it finally entered the Second World War, choose to fight with metal instead of men? Why did young officers and planners, looking at the terrible lessons already written in European soil, decide that the answer to military victory was not better tactics of maneuver, not more ambitious infantry assaults, not the kind of human courage that had already cost 1 million lives in the trenches, but rather ammunition? Vast, almost inconceivable amounts of it. This question lives at the very heart of what made American warfare different from every other nation locked in that immense struggle. It was not a decision made in a single moment, nor was it born from any single voice of genius crying out in the wilderness. Instead, it emerged gradually, almost organically, from something much deeper in the American character and circumstance, something that had been forming long before a single shot was fired at Pearl Harbor. It took shape in the quiet conversations between artillery officers who had studied the Great War, in the blueprints drawn by engineers who understood what American factories could actually produce, in the cold mathematics of officers who had finally begun to ask themselves a different kind of question altogether. That question was beautifully simple, though its consequences were not. If we have abundance, why do we spend scarcity? If we can send shells, why must we send boys? If machines can do the killing at a distance, why must we ask men to close with the enemy and do it face to face? The curious thing is that this was not obviously the answer that America would arrive at. There was nothing predetermined about it. Other nations, faced with similar circumstances, made entirely different choices. The Germans would choose to maximize the skill and aggression of their individual soldiers, to make every combat unit a sharp instrument of decisive maneuver. The British, constrained by the limits of their island resources, would develop different compromises, different balances between firepower and manpower. The Soviets, with their vast populations and their particular ideology, would embrace a doctrine of mass and sacrifice that made the mathematics work differently in their favor. But America stood in a unique position. America possessed something that no other great power possessed in equal measure: a functioning, intact industrial system on the home front, thousands of miles away from enemy bombers and artillery. America had coal and steel and petroleum flowing in abundance. America had a tradition of manufacturing, of making things in vast quantities, a peculiarly American genius for production that had already, in the decades before the war, transformed the way automobiles and radios and household appliances were made. And America, by contrast, did not have an ancient martial tradition, did not have a long-trained professional officer corps steeped in the tactics of European cavalry and foot soldiers. This, strangely, became an advantage. American officers could think differently, because they were not bound as tightly to centuries of assumption. So what if a nation approached warfare not as an art of deception and maneuver, the way a chess player thinks of the board, but as an engineering problem? What if you asked not, how do I outthink my enemy, but rather, how do I bring the maximum amount of violent force to bear on a specific point at a specific moment, and then do it all again, everywhere, at once? What if the question was not about the brilliance of individual soldiers or officers, but about coordinating the firepower of many guns through a system, a network, a mathematics that could be learned and practiced and repeated? If you subscribe to the full documentation of this journey through firepower doctrine, you will trace exactly how this philosophy emerged from the ashes of the First World War, took its first uncertain steps in the quiet arsenals and training grounds of the 1930s, and then, almost violently, transformed into the greatest industrial war machine the world has ever seen. You will hear the voices of the men who thought differently, who sketched new ideas on paper in small rooms, who tested those ideas on the Louisiana plains, and who finally, when the moment came, unleashed them with a fury that would reshape how every nation on earth thought about war itself. This is the story of how one country looked at a brutal problem and said, not with malice but with a certain pragmatic mercy, we will trade our industrial output for our sons' lives. We will spend steel so we do not have to spend blood. And in doing so, they created something that had never quite existed before in human history. A way of making war that was simultaneously more humane and more destructive than anything that had come before. A doctrine born from compassion and mathematics in equal measure. A philosophy that would echo through every conflict that followed and reshape the very meaning of what it meant to be a soldier. The path from those first quiet questions to the roar of the guns is a long one, and in many ways, it begins not on a battlefield at all, but in a factory, in an office, in the American mind itself, trying to solve a problem that seemed impossible to solve any other way. Before a single American soldier would ever stand in a European trench, before the doctrine would be written down, or tested or proved, the nation itself was already practicing the logic that would define its warfare. America, in the 1920s and 1930s, was, in a peculiar and almost accidental way, rehearsing for a kind of war that nobody had yet imagined. The factories were not thinking about doctrine, the railroad barons were not sketching battle plans, and yet, the machinery of American prosperity was already laying the groundwork for something unprecedented. Consider the sheer scale of what existed. By the early 1930s, American manufacturing capacity had become almost unthinkable to the rest of the world. The Ford Motor Company alone was producing automobiles at a rate that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. Assembly lines stretched across factory floors like rivers of metal and motion, each worker performing a single, perfected task over and over, day after day. This was not romance. This was efficiency. This was the logic of abundance applied to peace. What made this distinctly American was not merely the technology, though that mattered. It was a philosophical approach to production that had emerged from the peculiar circumstances of the nation itself. America had space, vast quantities of it. America had natural resources, coal and iron and oil, distributed across a continent. And America had labor, immigrant workers who flooded into industrial cities with the promise of wages and opportunity. The combination created something almost inevitable, a nation that thought in terms of scale, that trusted machines to multiply human effort, that believed prosperity came not from squeezing more from fewer resources, but from producing more of everything. The railroads had already done this decades earlier. By the turn of the century, the American railroad network had become the largest in the world, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, connecting farms to cities, mines to factories, factories to ports. Millions of tons of freight moved every day, guided by schedules and dispatching systems that were themselves marvels of industrial organization. A farmer in Kansas could know that his wheat would reach a mill in the Northeast, with predictable timing. A factory manager in Detroit could plan production knowing that raw materials would arrive on schedule. This was not magic. It was logistics. It was the systematization of abundance. During the 1920s especially, during those strange, prosperous years before the Depression, American industry seemed to have cracked a fundamental secret about modern civilization. You could produce more than you needed. You could build excess into the system. You could have surplus, and that surplus was not wasteful. It was security. It was flexibility. It was power. The automotive industry in particular had developed something that no other nation had quite mastered: the ability to produce hundreds of thousands of nearly identical products, each one requiring millions of individual decisions and movements, all coordinated through the factory system in such a way that mistakes were caught, variations were minimized, and output was maximized. The assembly line was not just a way of making cars. It was a way of thinking. It was a way of believing that the best approach to any problem was to break it down into smaller parts, to perfect each part, to link the parts together in sequence, and then to let the system run. Repeatability, standardization, predictability, these were the virtues. What is fascinating, though perhaps we should wonder softly about this, is that nobody in the 1920s was consciously preparing for industrial warfare. The Great War had ended only a few years before. Europe lay in ruins. The very idea that another global conflict might arise within a generation seemed almost unthinkable. Why would it? The League of Nations had been formed. Trade had resumed. The American stock market was soaring. The future, everyone seemed certain, belonged to businessmen and engineers and the market, not to soldiers. And yet, the American approach to production, already deeply embedded in the national character and the national economy, was creating the theoretical foundation for a very different kind of war than the world had ever seen. The old European armies had been built on the assumption of relatively scarcity. You trained your men carefully because training took time. You rationed your ammunition because ammunition was expensive to produce. You moved slowly and deliberately because you could not afford to waste resources on failed maneuvers. Every soldier was precious because soldiers took years to raise and train, and once you lost them, replacing them was difficult. American industry was teaching a different lesson. Resources were not precious in the same way. Space was not precious. What was precious was time and labor and efficiency. If you could build something once, you could build it again. If you could build it twice, why not build it 10 times? Why not build it 100 times? This was not greed exactly. This was abundance as a kind of practical philosophy. When you had the capacity to produce, production became the answer to almost every problem. The Depression, ironically, did not really change this fundamental orientation. It slowed production, certainly. It closed factories, created unemployment, and brought suffering to millions of Americans. But it did not change the underlying conviction that American prosperity, when it returned, would be built on the same logic: scale, efficiency, mechanization, and the transformation of natural resources into manufactured goods at unprecedented rates. By the mid-1930s, as the world grew darker, as aggressive movements stirred in Europe and Asia, American military planners began to wonder about something that their predecessors might not have asked. What if you could apply the logic of the assembly line to warfare? What if, instead of trying to preserve soldiers through careful tactics and limited engagements, you could produce so much material, so much ammunition, so much equipment, so many airplanes, that you could overwhelm an enemy not through brilliant maneuver, but through sheer volume? What if excess could be a strategy? The railroads still hummed along the same tracks. The factories still produced according to the same logic. But now, as the 1930s drew toward their close, men in uniform began to imagine what those factories and railroads might produce in a time of total war. The industrial soul of America, shaped by decades of mass production and the assumption of abundance, was about to be consciously bent toward a single, enormous purpose. The philosophy that had created the modern American economy was about to create a doctrine of warfare that would transform the conflict. By the time America's soldiers began arriving in France in 1917, the war had already settled into a rhythm of mechanized horror that no one in Washington had quite prepared them for. The trenches stretched for hundreds of miles, a landscape carved not by intention, but by exhaustion. Young men in khaki uniforms found themselves standing in mud that smelled of rust and rot, watching the artillery barrage that never seemed to end. And among those young men were officers, some barely older than the enlisted soldiers they commanded, who would watch and remember and later reshape how America fought. The British had already absorbed lessons that cost them hundreds of thousands of lives. At the Somme in 1916, a massive artillery bombardment was meant to cut the German wire and destroy the trenches, leaving the infantry free to advance. The problem was that the guns were not coordinated. Spotters could not see where shells were landing. There was no communication network, no way to adjust fire, no method for one commander to summon the concentrated power of many guns at once. So the British advanced into unbroken barbed wire, and in a single day, nearly 20,000 men fell dead. The French too had learned at terrible cost. They understood that artillery could break men. It was not dramatic or swift like a cavalry charge, but it was relentless. Shells arrived with a sound like the sky tearing. Mud erupted in fountains of earth. Men who survived the barrage often came forward trembling and unable to fire their rifles. The psychological weight of sustained bombardment was something generals had finally begun to understand by 1917. Among the American officers arriving in France was a quiet, methodical artillery major named William H. Morris, and beside him dozens of others who grasped something essential. If you could not coordinate your artillery, you were merely wasting ammunition and men simultaneously. They watched the French artillery officers work, observed the small adjustments that could be made when an observation post was placed high enough to see the target. They noticed that when guns were timed to fire together, when one barrage rolled forward in waves, when infantry moved in the shelter of that moving wall of explosions, fewer men died taking ground. But these were lessons written in blood, and for many months, American commanders still sent their soldiers forward in the old ways. Wave after wave of infantry attacked. Wave after wave fell. The officers who survived understood that this was not inevitable. This was the result of poor coordination, of treating the infantry as expendable. It was possible, they began to reason, that if you could invest enough in the artillery, if you could create a system that allowed one man with a radio to summon the fire of dozens of guns, if you could make the artillery so overwhelming that the infantry faced only broken and frightened men, then perhaps fewer Americans would need to die. General John J. Pershing, commanding American forces in France, saw this potential. He was not a sentimental man, but he grasped the economics of firepower. American factories could produce shells. American railroads could bring them forward. American soldiers were coming across the Atlantic in waves. If America could transform its industrial capacity into a doctrine of concentrated fire, then American lives might be saved. It was not mercy, exactly. It was calculation. But calculation could produce something that resembled mercy. The Meuse-Argonne offensive began in late September 1918, and it was here that American artillery was finally unleashed at scale. 400,000 soldiers attacked across difficult terrain, and they were preceded and supported by a rolling barrage from nearly 40,000 artillery pieces. For 77 days, the Americans advanced through terrain that should have cost them far more than it did. Certainly, there were casualties. The trenches were still brutal places where men with rifles faced men with rifles. But the artillery had already broken something in the German defense before American infantrymen ever encountered German infantrymen. When the war ended weeks later, the officers who had survived Meuse-Argonne carried forward a profound realization. They had not invented this doctrine yet. They did not have the radio networks or the fire direction centers that would later define American firepower. But they had glimpsed something true, that armies did not have to accept massive casualties as the price of victory, that steel could substitute for flesh, that a young man facing the choice between advancing into a storm of artillery or dying in a trench might, if supported by sufficient firepower, live to advance another day. In the 1920s and early 1930s, these officers dispersed back to quiet postings in America. Some taught at Fort Leavenworth or Fort Sill, the great artillery schools where doctrine was debated and refined. They spoke to younger officers about what they had seen in France, about the power of coordinated fire, about the vast Russian armies that had been broken not by German tactics, but by German artillery. They filled official reports with observations that, at the time, seemed almost radical, that infantry alone could not break through entrenched positions, that artillery required skilled spotters and careful calculation, that the future of warfare lay in the coordination of fire rather than in the courage of charging soldiers. The Somme and Verdun and Passchendaele lingered in their memory. The names of these places represented not glorious victories, but the exhaustion of nations that had thrown armies at each other until neither could continue. America had arrived in France late enough to observe this dynamic, but not so late as to avoid being touched by it. Some of the young officers who commanded regiments at Meuse-Argonne would, a generation later, command armies, and they carried with them the conviction that there had to be a better way than trading lives for yards of muddy ground. What emerged from this reflection was a doctrine that seemed, in certain lights, almost humane. If you accepted the premise that war was inevitable, that America might someday fight an enemy it could not negotiate with or contain, then did it not make sense to fight in a way that preserved your own soldiers? Did it not seem reasonable to spend money on weapons and ammunition rather than on the training and replacement of dead soldiers? The younger generation of officers who had walked through the Meuse-Argonne did not frame it quite this way, but the logic was there, waiting to be systematized and refined into something that could shape the next war. The 20s and 30s, those strange and austere decades between the wars, were not quieter than the conflict that preceded them, but they felt quieter. The guns were silent. The factories, which had thundered day and night to feed the terrible appetite of the Western Front, had begun to slow their furnaces. And in that lull, in those lean years of constrained budgets and shrunken armies, something curious happened in the minds of a particular breed of American officer, artillerymen mostly, pragmatists trained in mathematics and ballistics, who had stood in muddy observation posts and watched good soldiers die in waves across no man's land. They began to ask themselves a question that would reshape how America waged war. What if there were a way to trade the lives of men for the lives of machines instead? The arsenals of America in those years between wars were quiet places. Picket fences surrounded weapons depots where grass grew between rail tracks. The budgets were meager. Congress, exhausted by the spending of 1917 and 1918, wanted no more of military industry's hunger. And so, unlike the Germans across the Atlantic, who were quietly engineering new doctrines and new weapons in secret, the Americans worked with what they had, which was very little. But poverty, sometimes, breeds innovation. Scarcity forces thought. And so in those quiet years, a handful of visionary officers began to sketch something on paper that would never quite be called a doctrine officially, not yet, but which represented a fundamental shift in how Americans would think about firepower. The key insight was almost beautifully simple in its complexity. What if one observer, placed high and forward in the landscape, with a telephone line or eventually a radio back to the guns, could see the enemy and call down coordinated fire from many batteries at once? Instead of each gun firing alone, hoping its aim was true, imagine all the artillery of an entire regiment or a division focused at a single point on a map, at a single moment in time. The mathematics worked. Everyone could feel it. But making it happen in the chaos and fog of actual battle, that was another matter entirely. These officers, names that have faded now into the texture of military history, men like General Leslie McNair, who would shape American artillery doctrine so profoundly that it would survive him by decades, and the countless captains and majors and lieutenants who filled the war colleges and the artillery school at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, they understood something that was not obvious to everyone. They had seen, in the First World War, what happened when infantry advanced without overwhelming fire support. They had seen the photographs. They had read the casualty reports. They had, some of them, lived through the thing itself, and the memory of it, the awful weight of it, drove them toward a vision where machines would scream instead of men. But how do you build a doctrine on a whisper? How do you experiment when money is tight and ammunition is rationed, and the political will to maintain a large standing army has collapsed? The answer was slow and painstaking. These officers began to write manuals. They began to think through the geometry of observation and communication. They began, in their minds, to choreograph gunfire with the precision of a musical score. A forward observer sees a target. He calculates its range and position. He picks up a telephone, later a radio, and speaks to a fire direction center, where other men with pencils and maps begin their calculations. Those calculations are relayed to individual batteries, each commanding officer checking the figures, each gun laid precisely according to the numbers. And then, when the signal comes, all of them fire together, or in sequence, creating a wall of metal and high explosive that arrives at the target with such concentration and coordination that it breaks the enemy's will or his ability to fight before a single infantryman has to cross open ground. This was a radical thought in a way. Not technologically radical, The telephone and radio were already ancient technologies by the 1930s, but radical in its philosophy. It was saying, we will substitute organization for aggression. We will substitute coordination for courage. We will let geometry and calculation do the work that flesh and blood had been doing in the trenches, at the cost of thousands of lives for a few hundred yards of mud. The interwar arsenals, those quiet places, became laboratories of imagination. Imagine a young captain, working late at Fort Sill, sketching on paper the layout of a battery in relation to a fire direction center, drawing lines representing radio communication, thinking through the flow of information as if it were water moving through pipes. He is not building anything, he is thinking. But that thinking, that visualization of how fire could be orchestrated rather than scattered, that was the architecture of what was to come. These officers did not work in isolation. They read each other's papers, they attended courses, they moved from post to post, carrying ideas with them like seeds, planting them in conversations in officers' clubs, in lectures delivered to half-interested audiences of bored second lieutenants. The doctrine was building itself in the spaces between official channels, in the margins of authorized training, in the interstices of a military institution that did not yet know that it was being quietly transformed from the inside. And perhaps there was something fitting about this. The vision of precision, of calculation, of making war more efficient and less wasteful of human life. It was a vision that seemed to grow naturally from the American character. The country that had industrialized the manufacture of goods, that had rationalized production, that had built railways and assembly lines and made mass production into a kind of national philosophy, that country was now, almost without realizing it, industrializing warfare itself. But with a difference. A crucial difference. The motivation was not cruel or indifferent. It was born from compassion, from having seen too much blood spilled on the fields of France, from the desire that never again would American boys die by the thousands for a few yards of earth that did not matter. The budgets remained tight, the armies remained small, but the thinking grew larger and deeper, and so the interwar years, those decades that feel in the history books like a pause between the acts of a great tragedy, were actually a time of profound preparation, invisible preparations, theoretical preparations. The Americans, who would never again fight a war without overwhelming firepower superiority, were rehearsing that future in their imaginations, on paper, in the late afternoons in military schools, and in the quiet conversations of men who believed that there might be a better way. In the quiet offices and field tents, where artillery officers began sketching their ideas during those lean interwar years, there emerged a concept so simple in hindsight that it feels almost inevitable, yet when it was new, it represented something close to a revolution in how wars could be fought. It was called the Fire Direction Center, and it would become the beating heart of American Firepower Doctrine, a place where mathematics and radio waves and human judgment converged to transform scattered guns into something far more powerful than their sum. Before this innovation took shape, artillery had operated in a manner that had barely changed in decades. A battery commander, perhaps a captain with a telephone line stretching back to a regimental post, would receive coordinates or a description of a target, and then he would calculate, by hand, the adjustments needed for distance, for wind, for the drift of his own particular guns, for powder temperature and barrel wear. It was a slow art, learned through long experience, and if the day was chaotic or the communication unclear, the accuracy suffered. A gun crew would wait. Orders would arrive. They would aim and fire. Then they would wait again for word on whether the shell had struck true or fallen short, and the process of adjustment would begin anew, one slow correction after another. But somewhere in the analytical minds of a handful of forward-thinking officers, men who had studied mathematics and engineering as well as tactics, a different possibility began to take shape. What if, they wondered, the calculation could be centralized. What if, instead of each battery doing its own mathematics in isolation, there existed a single coordinated brain that could take reports from multiple observation points, synthesize that information, and then direct the fire of many batteries as though they were a single enormous gun? The vision was elegant and, from an engineering standpoint, almost audacious in its ambition. The technical heart of this vision was elegantly simple. An observer, say a forward observer attached to an infantry company or posted on a high ridge overlooking enemy positions, would watch the ground carefully, identify a target, and report its location back by radio or telephone, using a coordinate system that everyone understood the same way. That report would arrive at the Fire Direction Center, a small building or tent that might contain half a dozen officers and enlisted men. There, they would receive the target information and begin their calculations, not to solve for just one gun, but to solve for the entire battery, or even for multiple batteries at once. They would account for the particular characteristics of each gun in the group. The wear in each barrel created slightly different ballistic properties, small things that accumulated across a salvo into significant differences. They would factor in the weather. They would calculate the angle and elevation and timing needed for each gun to pour its fire onto the same point simultaneously, or in a carefully orchestrated sequence. And then, crucially, a single radio operator would transmit firing orders to all the guns at once. Fire, all guns, on such and such coordinates. Elevation so and so. What had taken perhaps 10 or 15 minutes when each battery had to solve its own problem independently could now happen across an entire group of guns in moments. The concentration of fire that resulted was far greater, more overwhelming, less likely to miss or to scatter ineffectively across a wide area. There is something almost meditative to contemplate in how this innovation worked in practice. Picture a young forward observer, lying on his stomach behind a ruined stone wall, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching a German position 3 kilometers distant where he can see soldiers moving, where he can see the flash of a machine gun position. He speaks quietly into a radio handset. The Fire Direction Center receives his voice. Men inside a tent, perhaps 2 kilometers back, pull out their maps and calculators. They work with a kind of calm precision. There is no pressure, really, at this moment. The mathematics is what matters. One of them might use a slide rule, that elegant predecessor to the electronic calculator, to solve the ballistic equations. Another might consult firing tables, printed references that contained pre-calculated solutions for various combinations of distance and elevation and ammunition type. Once the calculations are complete, a staff officer reviews them, a final human check, a moment where intelligence and experience make sure the numbers make sense, that no error in transcription or mathematics has slipped through, and then the order goes out. The radio crackles, and in moments, miles away, the gun crews hear their command. They adjust their guns to the calculated angles, the powder charges are loaded, the ammunition is placed in the breech, and then, almost as though responding to an invisible conductor's baton, all the guns of the battery, or perhaps all the guns of 2 batteries, fire as one. The earth shakes, the shock wave moves outward, and the target that the forward observer is watching simply ceases to exist, flattened under the convergent weight of many shells arriving almost simultaneously. The elegance of this system lay in what it accomplished without requiring any more guns or ammunition than had existed before. It was not brute force, not simply. It was organization. It was the application of systematic thought to the problem of coordinating firepower. And the military advantages were profound. An enemy position that might have withstood scattered, sporadic fire from individual gun crews found itself unable to survive the concentrated deluge that the Fire Direction Center could deliver. The surprise element was enhanced. because the coordinated barrage could arrive with little warning. The psychological effect on the receiving end was devastating. The sense that one had suddenly come under attack, not from a few guns, but from the sky itself. Perhaps most importantly, and most subtly, the Fire Direction Center made it possible for infantry officers to think differently about their role on the battlefield. An infantry company commander, watching his men prepare to assault a fortified position, could now request fire support with a different confidence. He could speak to an artillery liaison officer and ask, not for a few shells to land somewhere near the enemy, but for a specific, coordinated barrage, delivered with mathematical precision to a particular set of coordinates. And because the Fire Direction Center existed to coordinate and concentrate fire, there was a genuine possibility that the barrage would be overwhelming. The infantry could advance, knowing that the enemy's heads were down, knowing that the defenders had already taken casualties even before the assault began, knowing that they would not face the full strength of an undiminished defending force. It is easy, in retrospect, to see this as merely a technical improvement, one more step in the incremental evolution of military technology. But the officers who were developing these ideas, often in isolation and with limited resources, understood that something more profound was happening. They were changing, fundamentally, the relationship between machines and men in warfare. By making firepower coordination more efficient, more reliable, they were beginning to build a doctrine in which machines and ammunition could, in some measurable degree, substitute for human life. This was not a humanitarian impulse in any simple sense. War is not a humanitarian endeavor. But it was an impulse rooted in a recognition that if war had to happen, if men had to fight, then perhaps the burden could be distributed differently. Perhaps, just perhaps, fewer men had to die if machines could carry more of the weight. In the spring of 1941, on the flat, humid plains of Louisiana, the United States Army conducted a series of war games that would quietly reshape how American soldiers thought about killing and survival. These weren't small exercises. They were vast, involving tens of thousands of troops, real ammunition, observation teams that would become the generals of a coming war, and a fundamental question simmering beneath the dust and heat. When you have to fight, should you send more men forward or more shells? The Louisiana maneuvers stretched across hundreds of square miles. The landscape itself, pine forests and open fields, rivers and rough terrain, gave both sides something to work with, something to defend, something to attack. And it was here, in the careful choreography of these mock battles, that two American military philosophies collided like freight trains, not violently in any single moment, but gradually, through repetition and observation and the slow accumulation of evidence. On one side stood the older guard, officers steeped in what might be called the cavalry tradition, the doctrine of maneuver and concentration of force. They believed in movement, in the shock of massed infantry assaults, in the daring flanking maneuver that could undo an enemy's entire position with boldness and speed. There was a certain romance to it, a sense that the battle belonged to the quick-thinking commander and the soldier willing to charge forward with rifle and resolve. On the other side, increasingly, stood the artillerymen and the engineers, the mathematicians in uniform who had been quietly rewriting doctrine in the previous decade. They believed something different. They believed that in an age of defensive firepower, machine guns, entrenched positions, anti-tank guns, the equation of warfare had changed. You could not simply overwhelm a defense with courage and numbers anymore, not if the other side had dug in and prepared. Instead, you could prepare the ground. You could saturate a position with coordinated artillery fire so intense and so precise that when the infantry moved forward, they would encounter not an organized defense, but chaos, ruins, stunned survivors, momentum already broken. The Louisiana maneuvers tested these competing visions in the eyes of men who would command armies. And what many observers noticed, watching the exercises unfold, was something that would echo through the next 4 years of actual war. When the firepower-centric side executed its doctrine well, when the artillery was coordinated, when the fire direction center could translate a radio call into a coordinated barrage from multiple guns at once, the opposing side's traditional defenses simply crumbled. The maneuver-focused attacks, by contrast, often bogged down. They succeeded sometimes through audacity, but at visible cost, with clear casualties in the mock battles, with ground that had to be retaken. There was something almost unsettling about watching this happen repeatedly. The older officers, some of them, could feel the ground shifting beneath their doctrine. The younger ones, the ones who had embraced the emerging artillery philosophy, could feel vindication. But it was never quite as clean as a simple victory for one side, because the exercises were exactly that, exercises. They were intelligent approximations, but they were not war. No one truly died. No one's nerve broke because they had lost half their company. The psychological weight of actual combat, the human cost, was present only as a shadow, as a kind of mathematical abstraction. Still, the pattern was becoming undeniable. Major General Leslie McNair, who would become one of the architects of American Firepower Doctrine, was observing these maneuvers intently. He saw what the numbers were showing. He saw officers beginning to understand that if you could prepare the battlefield with artillery and air support, if you could break the enemy's will to defend through the sheer weight of coordinated fire before the infantry ever advanced, you could preserve American lives. You could trade something the United States had in abundance, steel, ammunition, industrial capacity, for something precious and irreplaceable, the lives of American soldiers. The old cavalry spirit didn't disappear. It never does. But in the Louisiana heat, with dust clouds rising from simulated bombardments and observers noticing which tactics produced results, a new American way of war was being born. The exercises showed something almost like a moral mathematics at work, though no one quite framed it that way at the time. One officer might think, if I can save 50 men by expending 50 tons of ammunition, what commander would not make that trade? But the cost of that philosophy, though it was not apparent in Louisiana in 1941, would become apparent soon enough. There were other maneuvers too, in other parts of the country. The Carolina exercises, smaller-scale experiments in Tennessee. Each one added another piece of evidence, another confirmation that the doctrine of massed fire, coordinated through the fire direction center and delivered by artillery, speaking to artillery across vast distances, could substitute for the terrible grinding frontal assaults of the previous generation's wars. And with each exercise, another cohort of junior officers, the ones who would lead companies and battalions into actual combat, absorbed this philosophy not as theory, but as practical observation. They had seen it work. They had watched the mock enemy collapse under coordinated fire. What the exercises could not predict, though, what no peacetime war game could quite capture, was how this doctrine would adapt and evolve when it met the chaos of real terrain, real fog of war, real defenders who were trying to kill you rather than simply moving to the next phase of an exercise. The Louisiana maneuvers had been conducted in spring, in clear weather mostly, with time and space for the complex orchestration of artillery and infantry to unfold with a certain logical precision. The actual wars that were coming would be messier. Rain would obscure observation, supply lines would be stretched, commanders would have to improvise, artillery would have to adapt to hedgerows and mountains and urban terrain. But the seed had been planted. American officers were beginning to carry with them, as they moved toward the war that would begin for them at Pearl Harbor, a quiet conviction that the modern army's greatest obligation to its soldiers was to prepare the battlefield so thoroughly, to soften the enemy so completely, that when the infantry advanced, the odds would be tilted as far as possible toward survival. Some called it humane. Some called it efficient. Some called it ruthless. It was probably all of those things at once. And in the humid Louisiana nights, as soldiers slept in tents and officers reviewed maps in the dim light of oil lamps, this new way of thinking about American warfare was taking shape, not with proclamations or grand speeches, but with the quiet authority of evidence, one exercise at a time. Out of this quiet laboratory work, out of the slide rules and the field reports and the endless conversations between mathematicians and artillery colonels, something began to crystallize. Not a battle plan, not yet, but a philosophy, a way of thinking about what war actually was or could be. It started with a deceptively simple observation. Every man who died in the infantry, whether from a machine gun or a shell, represented a loss that went far deeper than the body count on a casualty report. Each soldier was trained, educated. His life had intrinsic value, yes, but he also represented years of investment, of teaching, of disciplining, of binding him into a unit where trust and muscle memory meant everything. To lose a man in close combat, hand to hand, or in the yard-by-yard crawl toward a fortified position, was to lose not just a human being, but a component of an intricate machine that took months to assemble and calibrate. But steel, ammunition, artillery shells and tank rounds and the fuel that powered airplanes, these could be manufactured almost without limit. America had proven that. The factories would never stop. The railroads would never stop moving supplies. Trucks and ships would arrive with endless quantities of everything needed to fire, to explode, to destroy. And if a shell was wasted, if it missed its target or fell on empty ground, well, there would be another shell tomorrow. So the question that began to form, almost subconsciously at first, was this: why not let the machines take the risk instead? Why not trade ammunition for lives? It sounds almost brutal when stated so plainly, and perhaps there was something of that hardness in the calculations, but there was also something else, something that American officers didn't always articulate clearly, even to themselves. It was rooted in a kind of faith, not faith in God, though some felt that too, but faith in the idea that if you could saturate the enemy position with enough fire, if you could break his will to resist and shatter his ability to fight back before your own soldiers ever came within sight of him, you would lose fewer men in the end. The mathematics of it seemed almost merciful. Consider what happened in the traditional assault, the kind taught in all the European military academies, the kind that had defined warfare since Napoleon. Infantry moves forward, machine gun fire cuts them down. They move forward anyway, because that is what soldiers do. Shells land among them. More fall. The few who survive reach the wire, if there is wire, or the barricades, if there are barricades. Hand-to-hand combat follows. It is terrible and it is final. Hundreds of men might die to capture a position that was barely defended. But if you reverse the logic, if you first identified the position, mapped it, understood where the defenders huddled, in trenches or pillboxes or fortified farmhouses, and then you poured fire into that position for minutes or even hours, with artillery and with aircraft and with every gun that could reach it, then by the time your infantry arrived, what would they find? Defenders who were dazed, traumatized, their positions cratered and their weapons destroyed, their ammunition depleted, perhaps many of them simply gone, having fled or been killed. This was not an idea unique to America, of course. The British and the Germans and the Soviets had all discovered the power of massed artillery. But what was distinctly American, what made this philosophy take on such coherence and confidence, was the absolute certainty that the ammunition would never run out. In other armies, the artillery officer might hesitate before calling for a massive bombardment. In the German army, especially as the war progressed, That hesitation became a strangling constraint. Ammunition was precious. It had to be rationed. Every shell fired was a shell not available tomorrow. But an American artillery officer could call down fire with an almost casual abundance. Use as much as you need. We'll make more. The factories are humming. The ships are loading. Spend shells, not blood. Spend metal, not lives. It was an equation that could only be written by a nation that believed in its own industrial invulnerability. And here was the deeper philosophy beneath it all, the one that emerged slowly as officers studied the problem and tested their theories, in exercises and in conversation. It was rooted in something almost democratic, though the word might seem strange to apply to artillery doctrine. The infantry soldier, in the traditional assault, was being asked to do something almost impossible. He was being asked to advance into machine gun fire. He was being asked to do this because there was no alternative, because that was how war had always been. The best officers could hope to do was minimize the losses, accept them as the price of victory. But what if there was another way? What if you could spare the infantryman from that impossible demand? What if, through technology and organization and ruthless efficiency, you could present him with a battlefield that had already been partly conquered by fire, already broken and shattered, so that when he advanced, it was almost against an echo of the enemy, rather than against the full force of their resistance? That would be mercy, in a strange way. That would be a statement about what a soldier was worth. It would be saying, you are not expendable. You are not raw material to be thrown at a problem until it is solved. You are skilled, you are valuable, and we will spend whatever it takes in material to preserve you. The men who were developing this doctrine, sitting in offices and in field camps, writing reports and drawing diagrams and conducting exercises, were not philosophers, but they were, in their way, moral innovators. They were trying to solve a problem that had haunted warfare for centuries: how to achieve military objectives while respecting the lives of the men you commanded. The answer they were discovering was unsettling, because it seemed to suggest that you could achieve both, that humanity and efficiency could point in the same direction, that being kind to your soldiers and being ruthlessly effective as a military force were not opposing values, but complementary ones. But this raised another question, one that lingered in the background and would never fully resolve. What happened to all that fire when it was unleashed? Where did it land? What did it hit? If you were sparing American lives through abundance of ammunition, what were you doing to the enemy? And not just the enemy soldiers in their fortifications, but the landscape itself, the civilians who might be nearby, the very earth, which would bear scars that would take years to heal. These were questions that the doctrine's architects tended not to dwell on, at least not in the operational plans and the training manuals. The focus was on the calculation they could see and measure: American lives saved, American soldiers preserved, American boys going home to their mothers because there was another way. It was an appealing philosophy. It was, in many ways, a profoundly American one, and it was about to be tested in ways more comprehensive and more consequential than anyone in those quiet offices could have imagined. On a Sunday morning in December, as church bells were beginning to ring across quiet American towns, the nation's peacetime logic simply ceased to exist. The attack on Pearl Harbor didn't announce itself with ceremony or fanfare, but rather as a cascading sequence of explosions that turned the careful calculations of peacetime arsenals into historical relics within hours. What had been produced in measured, deliberate quantities for a hypothetical future war suddenly had to be manufactured in quantities that stretched the very meaning of industrial abundance. And within days, the sleeping factories of America, the ones that had been turning out civilian automobiles and household appliances, began their long, grinding transformation into something altogether different. The mobilization wasn't instantaneous, though it felt that way to those who lived through it. Machinery doesn't switch purposes overnight. Yet what was remarkable, what distinguished the American response from virtually every other nation's capacity to wage industrial war, was that the machinery existed at all. The railroads that had been carrying grain and livestock across the continent now carried ammunition. The steel mills that had supplied the construction industries of a booming nation redirected their furnaces toward the production of shell casings, gun barrels, and armor plate. The automobile factories, those cathedrals of American mass production that had made Henry Ford's promise of abundance seem almost mundane, began, almost dreamlike, to transform into vast assembly lines, producing not cars, but tanks, trucks, and the seemingly infinite components required to sustain a global war effort. What's worth pausing over is this. The industrial capacity was already there. It wasn't being built from nothing. The United States didn't need to invent manufacturing on a massive scale. It had been rehearsing it for decades. The production methods, the supply chains, the organizational structures, all of these existed in the consciousness of American industrialists and engineers. They simply needed to be redirected, refocused, scaled beyond what most people had ever imagined possible. And because the doctrine of firepower over manpower was already crystallizing in the minds of the Army's emerging leadership, this redirection had a clear purpose. Consider what was happening in a single day across hundreds of factories. In the Northeast, steel was being shaped into ammunition. In the Midwest, assembly lines that had been quiet in peacetime suddenly hummed with new purpose. In the South, new plants were being erected, with a speed that seemed almost impossible, constructed not with the careful deliberation of commerce, but with the urgency of survival. The federal government poured money into these expansions with an openness that would have been unthinkable mere months earlier. War bonds were sold, priorities were established, raw materials began flowing along routes that had been sketched out in advance by military planners who, even in peacetime, had been imagining precisely this moment. But the conversion from civilian to military production wasn't simply a matter of redirecting existing machines. It required innovation, adaptation, and an enormous amount of careful coordination. Take ammunition production, for instance. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States was producing artillery shells in quantities measured in thousands per month, sufficient for a small, professional military in peacetime. Within a year, production had to increase to hundreds of thousands per month. Within 2 years, to millions. The machinery had to become faster, more precise, more reliable. Workers who had been operating machine tools for automobile assembly had to learn new standards, new tolerances, new methods. Entire new factories had to be erected. Vast buildings that barely existed in the public imagination, where the actual machinery of destruction was assembled by workers, many of them women, who had never worked in munitions before. And as production ramped up, the supply chains had to keep pace. Copper ore had to be mined, transported, smelted, and turned into brass casings. Steel had to be produced to exact specifications. Gunpowder had to be manufactured, a process that itself was a science, requiring careful chemical mixtures that were dangerous to produce. All of this had to flow through a coordinating apparatus that hadn't existed before, that had to be invented, staffed, and organized. The production of ammunition was no longer a matter of blacksmiths or small factories. It was an industrial undertaking of staggering complexity, and it had to function with almost mechanical precision. What's particularly striking is how quickly the learning curve was compressed. American industrial engineers who had been solving problems of automobile production found themselves applying those same analytical methods to ammunition production. Efficiency experts studied manufacturing processes and suggested improvements. Industrial psychologists worked with management to understand how to organize labor most effectively. This wasn't always obvious, and it required genuine innovation, How do you organize a factory to produce millions of identical rounds of ammunition safely? How do you maintain quality control when production is increasing exponentially? How do you motivate and retain workers when the work is both crucial and dangerous? The answer was partly procedural, partly cultural, partly organizational. American industry had developed, over decades, a particular way of thinking about production, breaking complex tasks into simpler ones, training workers to perform specific functions, organizing them in ways that allowed for steady, predictable output. This wasn't inherently unique to America, but the scale at which Americans had already been practicing it, and the wealth of managerial and engineering experience that existed, gave the nation an enormous advantage. When the time came to mobilize, there were thousands of people who understood not just how to run a factory, but how to reorganize and optimize one. The transformation was also, in a subtle way, democratic. Yes, factories were being controlled by military priorities and federal regulations. Yes, workers had less say in where they worked and what they produced. But there was also a sense in which the entire civilian population was being drawn into the enterprise. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, taking on work that had previously been restricted to men. African Americans, despite the constraints of segregation and discrimination, found opportunities in industrial work that had been closed to them before. Immigrant communities, whose labor had powered American industrial growth for generations, continued to be central to the mobilization effort. The war effort, grim as it was, created a kind of industrial solidarity, a sense that everyone was contributing to something larger than themselves. The munitions that were beginning to flow out of these factories in such staggering quantities were intended to serve the emerging doctrine of firepower. But that doctrine wasn't yet fully realized. It was still being tested, refined, adapted to the reality of actual combat. The early months of the war, when American forces were fighting in North Africa and the Pacific, would reveal which aspects of the doctrine worked and which required modification. But the factories were already producing on a scale that assumed the doctrine would work, that the investment in ammunition would pay dividends in lives saved. It was an enormous act of faith, faith in the theories of artillery officers, faith in the calculations of fire direction centers, faith in the ability of machines to substitute for flesh in ways that the planners believed possible. The peacetime arsenals, those quiet places where ammunition was produced in modest quantities for a professional military, were being left behind. In their place arose something new, a vast coordinated industrial machine whose primary purpose was the production of destruction on an almost incomprehensible scale. And driving it all was an idea, barely tested, that Americans could wage war by converting their greatest national strength, industrial capability, into a form that would spare the lives of their soldiers by substituting, wherever possible, the expenditure of metal for the expenditure of blood. The factories were beginning to hum with this conviction, even as the doctrine itself was still being refined in the minds of officers in distant theaters, watching the first results of their theories play out in real combat. Behind every artillery barrage that bent German momentum, behind every coordinated volley that collapsed into a fortress valley, there moved something far less visible than smoke or flame. There moved paper. There moved railways and ships, and the quiet, methodical minds of men who had learned to multiply one shell into 10,000, and 10,000 into 1,000,000, and then to move that staggering weight across an ocean that wanted to sink it all. The doctrine of firepower abundance rested on a premise so simple it was almost overlooked. You cannot trade steel for blood unless you have steel. You cannot spare the infantryman unless someone has already assured that the ammunition will be there when he needs it. Not next week, not tomorrow, but today, in the exact quantity, at the exact place, at the exact moment the forward observer calls it down. By early 1943, The American arsenal had transformed into something no one in 1939 would have recognized. What had been sleepy ordnance depots, small collections of warehouses where supply officers kept meticulous ledgers by hand, had become vast industrial nodes connected by rail, by sea, by an intricate choreography of loading and unloading and redistribution. A single artillery shell, by the way, is not one simple object. It is a case, a powder charge, a fuse, a projectile. Each had to be manufactured separately, sometimes in different states, sometimes in plants hundreds of miles apart, and then assembled, packed, crated, labeled, and placed exactly where it needed to be when a battalion commander in North Africa sent word that he needed 500 rounds on a German position by dawn. Consider for a moment the scale. By 1944, the United States was producing roughly 5 million artillery shells per month. 5 million, each one a small industrial feat in itself, the product of mining, refining, machining, assembly, quality control. 5 million shells a month meant that somewhere, constantly, someone was making a decision about where they should go. Which theater needed them more? Which operation was coming next? Should they be sent to the Mediterranean or held for Normandy? Should they go forward to an artillery park near the front or staged in a depot 50 miles back, where they could be rushed forward as need demanded? The men who made these decisions rarely fired a shot. They worked in offices that grew increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed, with telephones and teletype machines and young officers trained in something that barely had a name yet, something we would eventually call operations research or logistics management. They created supply curves and demand forecasts. They built redundancy into the system so that if one ship was sunk, the ammunition still arrived. They created buffer stocks and priority lists. They thought in terms of flow rates and delivery schedules the way a modern software engineer thinks about bandwidth and latency. And it was terribly, quietly boring. A logistics officer in a supply depot in England, tracking ammunition loads for an operation scheduled 3 weeks hence, was engaged in work that would determine whether thousands of soldiers lived or died, and yet his day consisted largely of reviewing manifests and adjusting numbers on spreadsheets. The shells that would destroy a German bunker and keep American infantry from assaulting it directly came into existence because someone had calculated 6 months prior that the Third Army would need roughly 800,000 rounds in support of a specific tactical plan. The forward observer who called down fire, the artillery captain who directed it, the gun crews who worked the breaches, all of these men were visible, dramatic, heroic in the traditional sense. But the captain of supply, the quartermaster officer, the transportation specialist who had coordinated the movement of 40 freight cars full of ammunition from a factory in Missouri to a railhead in North Carolina, to a ship, to an English dock, to another rail line, to a truck convoy, to an ammunition park near an airfield in Normandy, they were equally necessary to the whole machinery of substituting shells for blood. What made this possible was the fact that America had, quite unintentionally, been rehearsing for exactly this sort of challenge for nearly 50 years. The transcontinental railroad network, expanded and refined and interconnected throughout the early 20th century, suddenly became a strategic asset of enormous value. The mass production techniques pioneered in automobile manufacturing, applied now to weapons and ammunition, created efficiencies that European factories, still operating on older principles, could not match. The American merchant marine, which had been expanding since before the war, became a vast conveyor belt across the Atlantic, moving not just ammunition, but also food, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, everything necessary to feed a military machine that had grown to consume resources at a scale unlike anything in human history. And there was something almost unspoken about this process, something that reflected a particular American confidence, or perhaps a particular American blindness. The assumption was that there would always be enough, that if we needed more, we would make more, that if one ship was lost, we would build another, that if a supply line broke, we would repair it. That abundance itself was a form of national character, not just an economic condition, but something deeper. A faith that industry could solve any problem, that efficiency could be perfected, that the right person with the right training and the right information could move mountains of steel across oceans and deliver them to exactly the right place. In this, the logistics officers were perhaps the truest believers in the doctrine of substituting firepower for manpower. They did not see soldiers as expendable exactly, but they understood with crystal clarity that soldiers were finite. You had so many bodies, and once they were gone, you had to train and equip more, and that took time. But factories could run around the clock. Workers could take shifts. Raw materials could be extracted from the earth. The only limit was imagination and will and the ability to coordinate complex systems under enormous pressure. By 1944, there were officers in the Army Service Forces who could describe the flow of ammunition through the pipeline the way a conductor might describe a symphony. They knew how many rounds were staged in England, how many were being manufactured in each state, how many were in transit on ships at any given moment. They could tell you not just the total but the specific types, the percentages of certain calibers, the distribution of specific ammunition types to specific divisions. They held in their minds a map of an entire continent's worth of supply chains, each line representing the possibility of failure, each node representing the opportunity to adjust and correct. One of the quieter revolutions of the American approach to warfare in this period was the acceptance that logistics was not simply a support function, something to be handled after strategy and tactics had been decided. Instead, it became almost a form of strategy itself. Operations were planned not just according to terrain and enemy positions and military objectives, but according to what the supply system could support. A general wanting to advance 100 miles had to know first how many trucks he had, how many gallons of fuel they could carry, how long supply lines would stretch, how many days of ammunition he could stockpile at his current position. The supply line was not a constraint imposed upon military plans, but rather a canvas upon which those plans had to be drawn. The ships that carried ammunition across the Atlantic were often nondescript, converted cargo vessels or purpose-built cargo ships, nothing like the drama of a troop transport. They sailed in convoys, protected by destroyers and escort carriers, constantly vulnerable to U-boat attack. Thousands of tons of ammunition would rest in the hold of a single ship, and if that ship was hit, if a torpedo found its mark, the explosion would be catastrophic. Yet the convoys sailed anyway, and mostly they arrived, and when they did, the ammunition was unloaded by stevedores and dock workers and truckers and rail workers, each one a small part of the chain, each one performing a task that seemed routine until you understood what the cumulative effect was. By the time a German position in Normandy was struck by hundreds of shells in rapid succession, the decision to send that much firepower in that particular direction had been made not days earlier, but weeks or months earlier, by people who would never see the result, people who simply understood their small piece of the larger mathematics and executed it with precision. What becomes clear when you think about the flow of ammunition across an ocean is that the doctrine of firepower abundance was not simply a military doctrine. It was a statement about American abundance itself, about the peculiar strength of a nation that had not been invaded, whose factories were not bombed, whose supply lines were protected by oceans. It was a strategy that could only be pursued by a country with enormous industrial capacity and the luxury of being far from the fighting. It was, in some sense, a strategy written by geography and economic power and then rationalized into a military philosophy. To choose to trade steel for blood, you had to be certain that you had access to far more steel than your enemies did, and that you could move that steel to where it was needed faster than they could adapt their defenses. That was a peculiarly American advantage, one that did not exist in Europe or Asia, and it reflected a choice, conscious or not, to leverage the one advantage America possessed completely and without question. The Soviet Union could trade bodies for geography and still win. Germany could innovate its way toward local superiority. But America could do what no other nation could do, which was to simply produce more of everything and move it all exactly where it needed to be. Now imagine the North African desert in late 1942, a landscape so vast and austere that it seemed to hold its breath. The American army was arriving in force for the first time, pouring ashore at Casablanca and Oran, stepping onto sand that had never felt American boots before, bringing with them theories and machines and a doctrine still half-written. This was where the great wager would be tested in earnest, not in exercises, not in maneuvers on the flat grounds of Louisiana, but against an enemy that had already perfected the art of armor, the Wehrmacht, which had spent 3 years writing its own violent philosophy across Europe. And in those first months of 1943, as American units pushed eastward toward the Germans holding Tunisia, something remarkable began to happen. Something that would either validate all those years of planning or consign them to memory as wishful thinking. The desert itself seemed to conspire with the American doctrine. Endless vistas of gravel plain and rocky outcrops offered sightlines that stretched for miles. No forests to hide in, no rivers to offer natural defensive lines, no hedgerows to break up formations. It was terrain that invited a certain kind of warfare, one in which you could see the enemy coming, one in which artillery could dominate the open ground with a clarity that mountainous or wooded country would never permit. And the Germans, confident in their tanks and their tactics, seemed almost to welcome the challenge. They understood armor, they understood maneuver. What they were less prepared for was the sheer weight of metal that could be brought down upon them from beyond visual range. Picture, if you will, a forward observer lying in the dust with binoculars pressed to his eyes. He is young, probably in his early 20s, and his job is both simple and impossibly consequential. He watches, he counts, he calculates the distance to the German columns moving across the open desert floor, and then he picks up a radio, speaks a few brief, coded phrases, and vanishes back down into the rocks where he came from. In battery positions 5, 10, sometimes 20 kilometers behind him, gunners who cannot see what he sees respond to those carefully chosen words. They don't aim at targets they can perceive. They don't watch where their shells land. They trust in mathematics, in a coordinate system, in the invisible web of calculation that has been rehearsed 1,000 times. And when those shells arrive, when the desert erupts in a line of detonations, precisely where the Germans didn't expect them, something shifts in the physics of warfare itself. It is worth pausing to ask what might have happened under a different doctrine entirely. Picture an American commander clinging to older ideas, insisting on frontal assaults, demanding his infantry close with the German armor, in desperate hand-to-hand contests. The casualties would have been incomprehensible. American boys, many of them drafted just months before, would have learned what Verdun and the Somme had taught a generation before them. But that isn't what happened. Instead, when German armor formations appeared on the horizon, the Americans did something almost mathematically cold. They stopped. They didn't panic or freeze. They calculated. They called for fire. The artillery pieces themselves were not revolutionary machines. The 105mm howitzer, the workhorse of American field artillery, was reliable and well designed, but it wasn't particularly advanced compared to German guns. What was revolutionary was how they were used. The idea that artillery fire could be so precisely coordinated, so rapidly adjusted, so overwhelming in its concentration, was still relatively new in warfare. It required a certain cultural confidence in the power of organization and calculation, a belief that geometry could accomplish what courage alone could not. And the Americans, fresh from their industrial heartland, brought that confidence with them to the desert. In the early engagements, particularly at places like Kasserine Pass, the American army learned hard lessons. Some of those lessons came at considerable cost. German armor was formidable, their commanders experienced, their coordination crisp. The Americans made mistakes. They didn't always position their artillery correctly. They didn't always shelter their forward observers in defensible locations. They sometimes failed to understand how to use their air power in conjunction with ground fire. But each mistake was studied, analyzed, discussed in quiet command posts, where young staff officers worked by lamplight to understand what had gone wrong and how it might never happen again. And as the months progressed, as winter turned to spring in that strange desert landscape, something began to crystallize. German tank columns, which had once seemed almost invincible, began to lose their power to terrify. They were still formidable, still dangerous, still capable of devastating an unprepared American unit. But they were no longer the masters of the battlefield. They had become instead targets for a process, objects in a mathematical calculation that they didn't understand and couldn't predict. The forward observer lying in the dust had become more important than the tank commander crossing the open ground. The artillery gunner, cranking elevation dials hundreds of kilometers away, had become more important than the infantryman in the firing line. Consider what this meant for the soldiers themselves, though we might hesitate to claim that anyone in war has it easy. The American infantryman, advancing across the desert floor, was no longer walking into machine gun fire to close with an enemy he could barely see. He was advancing behind a wall of artillery fire that had already broken the German will to resist, already disrupted their coordination, already convinced their commanders that this position could not be held. It was still dangerous. Combat is always dangerous. Men still died. But the mathematics of survival had shifted in their favor, and those who survived would carry something of that experience forward, understanding in their bones that America's philosophy of warfare had worked, that machines could replace flesh, that calculation could replace courage, that abundance could defeat skill. What might surprise us, looking back across the decades, is how quickly the adaptation occurred. The doctrine hadn't been written in stone. It had been a hypothesis, a theory born in quiet conversation and staff exercises. But the desert had proven it true, and once proven, it took on the certainty of revelation. German officers, watching from their side of the battlefield, began to understand that they were no longer fighting American soldiers in the traditional sense. They were fighting the American industrial system, the American faith in organization, the American willingness to expend metal instead of blood. And slowly, that realization began to shift the course of the war itself. The North African campaign, which might have been merely a sideshow or a preliminary chapter, became instead the proving ground where American doctrine came of age. It was here, in the dust and heat and terrible clarity of the open desert, that the idea of massed firepower, coordinated by mathematics and radio, found its first real validation. It was here that American officers and men learned to trust the theory they had been rehearsing. And it was here that they began to understand what their industrial nation could accomplish when it bound its abundance to strategic purpose. The mathematics that had worked so well on the endless North African plain began to break apart the moment American guns began firing into the Sicilian hills in July of 1942. What had taken shape in those ordered Louisiana maneuvers, what had been refined through months of coordinated barrages across open desert, All of it suddenly encountered the oldest of enemies, geography itself. Mountains do not care for efficiency. Valleys swallow sound and signal. Slopes turn coordinated fire into a problem of angles that textbooks had not adequately prepared anyone to solve. The doctrine of massed fire, that beautiful and carefully constructed belief that enough coordinated shells arriving at once could break an enemy's will before a single infantryman had to cross open ground, was about to meet its first serious test against something far less forgiving than German panzers rolling across flat terrain. The Sicilian campaign, brief as it was, began to reveal a troubling truth that would deepen throughout the Italian campaign that followed. The Germans had spent years fortifying positions in mountainous country. They understood, with the clarity of soldiers who had fought and survived in the Balkans and Russia, that high ground and prepared defenses could reduce the advantage of massed artillery fire. When shells fell into a narrow valley where defenders were dug into the far slope, the blast energy dispersed upward and sideways rather than concentrating its fury where it mattered most. Soldiers sheltering in caves carved into limestone could survive impacts that would have obliterated them in the open. The very terrain that American doctrine had learned to defeat, flatness, exposure, was being replaced by something far more ancient and troublesome: the fortress mountain, the defended ridge, the ravine that turned every approach into a killing ground. Yet it was precisely at this moment, faced with these new constraints, that the artillery officers and fire direction center operators began to discover something almost unexpected. Their system was flexible enough to adapt. The rigid, beautiful mathematics of massed fire could be bent without breaking. Consider the peculiar challenge of a narrow valley, where German anti-tank guns were positioned on a ridge. Standard doctrine would call for preparation of the enemy position from multiple batteries, converging fire from different angles to achieve saturation. But in Sicily, and increasingly in Italy, the terrain often prevented this. Guns could not be positioned to create the overlapping fields of fire that textbooks prescribed. The valleys ran north and south, while the defenders ran east and west. The hills blocked radio signals. The distances changed constantly as an army climbed and descended again. What emerged, almost organically, from this pressure was a kind of tactical improvisation, built on the foundation of centralized fire control. A forward observer perched on some exposed peak might call in fire from batteries positioned miles away on the opposite side of a valley. Guns that could not possibly see their target, but could rain shells down into a narrow ravine with surprising precision. This required absolute faith in the fire direction center, in the mathematics being performed back at headquarters, in the assumption that a trained soldier with a radio and a map could substitute for what the gunners themselves could no longer see. It was, in a strange way, both deeply mechanical and deeply trusting, a human being trusting a system, trusting the calculations of unseen men, trusting that technology could bridge the gap between intention and result. The mountains of Sicily presented another puzzle that demanded constant small innovations. When an enemy position lay on the reverse slope of a hill, that is, on the far side from the attackers, standard indirect fire was often impossible. A shell fired at a high angle to clear the hilltop would drop down onto the far side, yes, but with less precision, less concentrated force, and the defenders had often positioned their machine gun nests precisely in places where this angle of fire was most difficult. The American artillery officers began experimenting with what might be called cross-valley fire, positioning guns on one ridge to fire across a valley at targets on another ridge at roughly the same elevation. This was not textbook artillery. This was artillery learning to think like mountaineers, like men who understood that every inch of ground had a shadow side, a blind spot, a place where conventional doctrine could not easily reach. As the campaign pressed on and American forces pushed inland across Sicily toward Messina, and then as the summer of 42 turned to the long, grinding Italian campaign that would consume nearly 2 years of American lives, the doctrine of firepower substitution for manpower was tested in ways that were both more subtle and more profound than North Africa had demanded. The losses did not disappear. No amount of artillery could remove the simple fact that infantry had to eventually climb hills, cross rivers, assault positions that had been fortified with German engineering and German stubbornness. But what the mountains of Sicily had forced the American Artillery Corps to learn was this: the doctrine was not fragile. It could bend. It could adapt. The core principle: use mathematics and machines to solve what could be solved, so that fewer soldiers had to die solving what could not, remained true even when the terrain made everything exponentially harder. There is something poignant in the archival photographs of these early Italian campaigns, if you look at them with attention to what they reveal about American adaptation. You can see forward observers in positions that seem impossibly exposed, men alone on hillsides with radios, carefully describing what they see through binoculars to men they will never see, men performing calculations they will never hear. You can see the strange geometry of fire direction centers established in captured buildings or roadside farmhouses, men bending over maps by candlelight, drawing lines, calculating distances, trusting that their work will translate into shells arriving at distant targets with enough accuracy and enough force to matter. The system was never meant to be this flexible. It had been born in the confidence of the North African desert, where open ground and long sight lines made everything simpler. But America's advantage, it turned out, was not rigidity, but the capacity to learn while fighting, to adjust doctrine without losing faith in its central truth. The Sicilian campaign lasted just 38 days. The Italian campaign would drag on for nearly 20 months, a slow, grinding, terrible progress up a peninsula that seemed designed by God or geology to defeat all doctrine equally. And yet, throughout those mountains and valleys, the doctrine of massed coordinated fire, adapted and innovated and pushed beyond its original conception, continued to prove its central premise: that Americans would accept a heavier demand on their industrial base and their logistics system, that they would spend ammunition and fuel and rubber and steel in prodigal quantities, if doing so meant spending fewer American lives. The mountains made this harder. The mountains made it more expensive. The mountains forced every principle to be questioned and sometimes bent. But they did not break the fundamental logic. They only made it more urgent, more necessary, more morally freighted with the knowledge that there truly were no easy answers, that courage would still be required, that mountains are patient and doctrines are temporary, and that the cost of substituting steel for blood is measured in both metals and in the haunted eyes of men who have spent weeks sleeping in the rain on the side of a mountain, waiting for tomorrow's battle. When the landing craft descended toward Normandy's beach on that first morning in June, the American soldiers packed into their hulls were riding the full expression of a doctrine that had spent 2 decades being refined in quiet rooms and dusty training grounds. What they could not see from below the waterline was the architecture of fire that had already begun reshaping the terrain above them. The German fortifications that might have seemed impregnable from a distance, the concrete bunkers, the machine gun nests, the carefully sited artillery positions dug into the bluffs, were about to meet something the defenders had never fully anticipated: a coordinated tempest of metal delivered from 3 directions at once. The Navy's role in this symphony had been planned with almost musical precision. Off the coast, battleships and cruisers lay in wait, their great guns trained on targets that spotters had identified weeks before through photographs and intelligence. When the signal came, these ships, vast floating fortresses that seemed to belong to an earlier, more romantic age of warfare, began delivering shells the size of automobiles onto German positions. A 16-inch shell from the USS Texas or the USS Arkansas didn't merely damage a bunker, it erased it. The impact of so much metal arriving from the sea at speeds greater than the ear could follow created a kind of acoustic and psychological rupture. Listen, in the moments before dawn, when the bombardment began, the deep rolling thunder of the naval guns, the whistle of shells passing overhead, the earth-shaking concussion of detonation, German soldiers sheltering in their emplacements felt not just the impact but something deeper, a violation of their sense that their fortifications meant anything at all. This was the doctrine's first principle enacted at scale: let machinery do what flesh ordinarily does, and let flesh be spared that burden. As the morning progressed, and the first waves of soldiers waded through the surf into withering small-arms fire, the doctrine continued its work overhead. Tactical air power, sleek fighters and medium bombers arrived in waves to strafe and bomb positions that threatened the beach. The coordination between ground forces, naval gunfire, and air support required a precision that seemed almost miraculous given the technological limitations of radio communication in 1944. A forward observer on the beach, or sometimes still offshore in a control ship, would relay target information. That information would flow through the Fire Direction Center, where officers and enlisted men would plot coordinates, calculate angles and charges, and within minutes summon firepower from sources the infantrymen might never see. What could have been a static, bloody frontal assault, men advancing into prepared defenses, absorbing terrible casualties as they closed the distance, was instead being shaped by artillery, by naval gunfire, by aircraft. The artillery itself, positioned just inland where it had been brought ashore in earlier waves, was now firing in support of the advancing infantry. American artillery doctrine had evolved to allow for something called TOT fire, time on target, where guns positioned at different distances from the target would adjust their timing so that shells from all guns would arrive at the same moment, creating a simultaneous explosion across the objective rather than a rolling barrage. It was a small mathematical triumph, but when multiplied across dozens of batteries, it had enormous tactical effect. The hedgerows themselves, those thick, ancient walls of vegetation and root that divided the Norman countryside into a patchwork of small fields, presented a challenge that no amount of firepower could completely solve. These natural fortifications favored the defender. They provided cover and concealment for German soldiers, and they broke up American movement into small, isolated groups, vulnerable to sudden counterattack. Yet even in this close, confused fighting, the doctrine's logic persisted. Rather than sending wave after wave of infantry to break through a hedgerow, artillery would be called in first. The guns would saturate the area around a hedgerow position, and often the psychological effect alone, the simple fact that tons of high explosive had just arrived with no warning, would compel the Germans to abandon their position or to retreat to the next line. The infantry would then advance through the zone of destruction, moving from shell crater to shell crater, using the very wounds that artillery had inflicted as shelter from fire. Was this humane? The question emerges almost unbidden when one studies the tactical details. By any measure, it was effective. American casualties were significant, but substantially lower than they might have been had the doctrine not been in place. The infantryman was no longer the primary tool of advance. He had become, in a sense, the beneficiary of advance prepared for him by artillery. One can almost imagine the thoughts of those who advanced across the Norman countryside in those first weeks. The gunners and forward observers who moved with the infantry, calling fire down on targets that threatened their comrades. They inhabited a peculiar world. Behind them, miles away sometimes, the guns roared. Ahead of them, the earth convulsed. They moved through an environment that had been prepared by fire, that was being continuously reshaped by fire, And yet they themselves had relatively little control over when that fire came or where precisely it would fall. The forward observer, sometimes a sergeant, sometimes an officer, invariably a man of tremendous burden and responsibility, became the nerve of the system. He was the eyes, the mind that saw the target and understood what firepower should be summoned. A simple radio call, fire mission, grid 47, would set in motion a process that, within seconds or a few minutes, would result in someone's enemy being killed from a distance beyond their comprehension. This was the doctrine's strange algebra: death made efficient, killing made systematic, the individual infantryman's burden of close combat reduced by the coordinated application of firepower delivered by unseen hands. The integration of these three systems, naval gunfire, tactical air power, and artillery, represented something qualitatively new in warfare. It required coordination not just between neighboring units on the ground, but between the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army. It required radio networks that worked reliably. It required spotters trained to call in accurate targeting information. It required a level of trust between command structures that were, in some ways, operating independently. And it required American industrial capacity to produce enough ammunition to make the doctrine viable. The Hedgerow campaign consumed artillery ammunition at rates that would have been impossible to sustain for any other nation in the world. Thousands upon thousands of shells, each one requiring raw materials, manufacturing, transport, and careful accounting. The logistics of this system were almost invisible to the soldiers doing the fighting, yet they were utterly essential to everything the doctrine made possible. There was, in the Normandy campaign, and particularly in the weeks of hedgerow fighting that followed the initial landings, a kind of eerie harmony to the way these systems functioned. The Navy would strike at points of German concentration. The Air Force would interdict reinforcements and suppress air defenses. The artillery would pound defensive positions and provide intimate support to advancing infantry. And the infantrymen, moving through terrain that had been scoured by fire, would complete the work, securing territory, defeating isolated defenders, establishing positions from which the cycle could repeat. Did this spare American lives? The evidence suggests yes, substantially. Did it transform what would otherwise have been an even more costly campaign into something that American society and American military forces could absorb? Almost certainly. And yet the doctrine, even in its triumph on the fields of Normandy, carried within it an uncomfortable paradox that would only become clearer as the war continued and American firepower grew more absolute. The desire to spare one's own soldiers by expending metal instead of flesh was profoundly understandable, profoundly human even. And yet the mathematics of war, the way that shells and bombs don't distinguish between combatants and civilians, between military objectives and proximity, meant that the kindness toward American soldiers produced consequences elsewhere. But that reckoning would come later. In the summer of 1944, in the hedgerow country where the doctrine first truly proved itself in sustained, complex combat, the primary reality was that American soldiers were advancing, German forces were being pushed back, and the machinery was working as those who had designed it hoped it would. The guns continued their thunder. The earth continued to shake, and through it all, something precious, measured in lives spared, was being purchased with something abundant: steel. The cold that December was different, not merely the cold of Europe in winter, but a cold that seemed to carry a kind of finality, as if the earth itself knew what was coming. In the darkness before December 16, 1944, American soldiers huddled in foxholes along a quiet sector of the Belgian front, a sector chosen precisely because it was quiet, where tired troops could rest before rotating home. The Germans, meanwhile, were preparing something that had not been seen in months: a massive, concentrated push, an offensive, The doctrine that had proven itself across North Africa and Sicily and Normandy was about to face its most severe test, not against dispersed defensive lines, but against coordinated, determined, and deathly serious German armor moving westward under cover of fog and darkness. What happened in those early hours was a kind of violent eruption. German artillery opened fire across the front in a bombardment so concentrated, so sudden, that it seemed almost to belong to another war. Thousands of shells fell on American positions, and the very ground seemed to convulse. Yet this time, the Americans did not simply absorb the blow and retreat. Instead, what had been building for 4 years, in quiet staff rooms and during the Louisiana maneuvers, in fire direction centers, and in the patient calculations of artillery officers, all of that emerged now into crystalline purpose. The doctrine of massed firepower was no longer a theory or a promising experiment. It was a necessity. It was survival itself. The mechanics of what followed were profound in their quiet way. As German columns punched westward, American artillery observers, spotters, and forward observers began the work they had practiced endlessly. They saw movement, they called it in. Those radio messages, those simple coordinates and target descriptions, traveled not to a single gun, but to a vast distributed network of artillery pieces spread across miles of Belgian countryside. Fire direction centers, those rooms where men with maps and slide rules and mathematics had become as essential as gunners, received the calls and began their calculations. How far? How high? What angle? What elevation? Within minutes, not hours, but minutes, dozens of artillery batteries received coordinated fire commands, and the sky, which had been relatively quiet moments before, became a streaming river of shells moving eastward. The Germans, who had expected to advance with momentum, who had hoped that speed and darkness and American exhaustion would carry them toward their objectives, found instead that they were moving into a storm of steel that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Artillery fire, coordinated at the battery level, at the battalion level, at the divisional level, created what observers began to call a wall of fire, not ragged and disorganized, but orchestrated, synchronized. The doctrine had evolved into something the Germans had not truly encountered at this scale and with this precision. And crucially, and this is something worth holding in mind as you drift through these details, the German advance slowed. Not because American infantry threw themselves forward in human waves, not because of brilliant maneuver or tactical surprise, but because American firepower, American ammunition, American industry, and American mathematics had created an environment where advancement became unsustainably costly. As the battle continued through those bitter days and colder nights, as the fog lifted and American aircraft could finally enter the fight, as supply lines held and ammunition continued to flow, the story of what might have been catastrophic somehow transformed. The Germans had hoped to divide the Allies, to create a second front that might force peace negotiations. Instead, they encountered a doctrine that had learned to turn the burden of defense into an advantage. Artillery did not merely defend positions. It created a perimeter of fire that moved with the battle, that adapted to new German thrusts, that was fed by radio reports and updated constantly. The fire direction centers never slept. The ammunition trains kept moving through the snow. The gunners, their hands numb and their fingers nearly useless in the cold, kept loading, firing, reloading. Consider for a moment what this meant in human terms. Consider the calculation embedded in this doctrine. It meant that commanders, faced with German pressure, did not necessarily order the infantry forward into the teeth of the assault. Instead, they picked up a radio, they sent a message, and mathematics and machines answered. Shells fell where men might otherwise have had to walk into fire. The doctrine, tested now under the most severe conditions, revealed its essential logic. It was not truly about artillery or ammunition or firepower as abstractions. It was about a choice. A choice to spend resources rather than lives, when the choice could be made. And in the freezing darkness of the Bulge, that choice meant the difference between acceptable losses and catastrophic ones. The strange mathematics of that battle haunts military historians still. The Germans committed perhaps 200,000 men to their Ardennes offensive. The Americans, caught by surprise, absorbed the blow with forces already stretched thin. By any historical standard, by the logic of previous wars, this should have been a disaster. Instead, American casualties, while significant, remained below what they might have been. And a great deal of the reason for this can be traced directly back to those fire direction centers, to the artillery observers calling in coordinates in the dark, to the thousands upon thousands of shells that flew eastward into the night, to the doctrine that had slowly transformed American warfare from an imitation of European practices into something distinctly American, distinctly industrial, distinctly humane in its own peculiar way. What the Bulge proved was something almost philosophical in nature. It proved that the doctrine worked not only in theory or in controlled exercises, but under the most chaotic, most desperate, most unforgiving conditions imaginable, when commanders could not maneuver, when the weather prevented air support, when supply lines were threatened, when men were cold and tired and afraid. The apparatus of American firepower still functioned. It still answered the call. The doctrine had become, in some sense, a substitute for the brilliance of tactical improvisation. It was a system that could function even under stress, even under surprise, precisely because it had been so thoroughly woven into the army's structure, its thinking, its fundamental approach to warfare. And so, as those December days turned into January, as the German advance slowed and then stopped and eventually collapsed, the doctrine stood proven in the crucible. Not every battle would confirm it so clearly, not every condition would play to its strength so perfectly, but the Bulge had provided a kind of testimony that would echo through military thinking for decades to come. The artillery, the ammunition, the mathematics, the coordination, the industry behind it all had held when nothing else seemed certain, and somewhere in those frozen fields, in the impact craters and the smoking gun emplacements and the silent ammunition dumps, the American way of war had found something close to its final form. No section headers allowed in this format. Yet beneath the mathematics and the machinery, there were human hands holding pens in darkened tents, trying to find words for what they were living through. Letters came home from artillery positions all across Europe. Some made it, others were censored or lost entirely, and in those careful, hesitant sentences, a strange portrait emerges of men who had learned to live inside an industrial storm without being torn apart by it. A forward observer attached to an artillery battalion wrote in November of 1944, somewhere in the mud of Belgium, about the peculiar sensation of calling down fire from 5 miles away. He described how the telephone wire connected him to the fire direction center, how his voice became a kind of remote control for destruction, and how this distance, this merciful, terrible distance, created an almost dreamlike quality to the work. He could not see what he was killing. He could only hear the static hiss and wait for the distant roar that confirmed the guns had fired. There was something almost unreal about it, he wrote, something that let a man keep a part of himself separate from the violence his orders unleashed. And perhaps this, he seemed to suggest without quite saying so, was what the doctrine had truly created, not just a method of war, but a psychological space where American soldiers could function inside mass destruction without drowning in the weight of it. A gun crew commander from Texas described the strange monotony of artillery work in a letter dated 3 days after Christmas, 1944. They had been firing for 18 hours straight during the German counteroffensive, he explained, and the guns had become almost like machines themselves. Load, fire, load, fire. The commands coming down a chain from officers who relayed coordinates from forward observers they could not see. The commander wrote about the peculiar calm that settled over the gun position after the first few hours of intense fire. The noise, which had seemed deafening at first, became almost background, like standing near a waterfall long enough that your ears stopped hearing it. The men worked with the smooth efficiency of ritual, each one knowing exactly what the others would do next. There was no thought involved anymore, he wrote. Thought would only get in the way. And strangely, he confessed, there was a kind of comfort in that, in becoming part of the machinery, in letting the doctrine carry you along instead of asking yourself too many questions about what you were doing. Another letter, from a sergeant who served as a surveyman calculating firing positions, painted a quieter picture still. His work was pure geometry, measuring angles, distances, compensating for wind and temperature, and the slight variations in altitude across the landscape. There was mathematics in it, precision, the kind of problem-solving that had nothing to do with the destruction that would follow. When he worked, truly focused on his calculations, he could almost convince himself he was back in engineering school, solving problems that had no blood in them. The guns would fire his numbers, men would die somewhere he couldn't see, but for the hour or two he spent working the equations, he existed in a space that was almost innocent. Was this a mercy, he seemed to wonder, or just a very elaborate way of avoiding the truth? He never quite answered the question, but the fact that he was asking it suggests something profound about what the doctrine had created. A system that let men participate in industrial slaughter while maintaining a kind of psychological distance that kept them functional. What emerges from these letters, when you sit with them long enough, is the portrait of men who had been given a strange gift by this doctrine of firepower. They were being asked to kill, yes, but at a remove. They were being asked to contribute to destruction, but through the filters of mathematics, machinery, and methodology. The doctrine didn't erase the reality of what they were doing, but it did create a kind of compartmentalization, a way of functioning that let the human mind process the unprocessable. A radio operator wrote about the peculiar intimacy of hearing the forward observer's voice come through the static, knowing that somewhere in the darkness ahead, this man was lying in frozen mud, looking through binoculars at enemy positions, speaking coordinates into a handset while shells from friendly guns screamed overhead. The radio operator couldn't see any of this, of course. He just heard a voice, sometimes calm, sometimes tight with fear or urgency. But there was something in that voice, a kind of human connection through a mechanical system that made the work feel less like button pushing and more like collaboration. Even in the act of calling down fire, there was a thread of human caring woven through the machinery. The forward observer was protecting the infantry. The artillery was supporting him. Everyone had a role in a system that, while producing tremendous violence, was designed with the fundamental intention of sparing American lives wherever possible. One particularly moving letter came from a battery commander who had been observing his guns fire on a German strongpoint that had been holding up an infantry advance. For nearly 2 hours, they pounded the position, rounds after round, until finally the German fire ceased. The infantry moved forward, and the battery commander realized that the lives saved by his guns that day, infantrymen who would have walked into that murderous fire, would probably never know that his hands had helped save them. There would be no gratitude, no acknowledgement. The system was too large, too disconnected for that kind of human recognition. And yet, he wrote, there was something sustaining in knowing that the mathematics he had ordered, the shells his men had loaded, the fire his guns had poured into that hillside, had translated directly into American soldiers going home to their families. The doctrine had no room for sentiment, but it had created a structure within which sentiment could exist, the deeply human desire to protect your comrades, translated into firepower. These letters, when read in aggregate, reveal something that the statistics and the battle reports cannot quite capture. The doctrine of firepower wasn't just a military theory. It was a philosophy that allowed men to function inside a mechanized war without losing their humanity entirely. The factories weren't just producing shells, they were producing a kind of psychological armor. The fire direction centers weren't just calculating coordinates. They were creating a structure within which men could contribute to warfare while maintaining a distance from its most brutal aspects. And perhaps this was the deepest insight the doctrine provided, though few of the men living it would have articulated it in these terms. By substituting machines and ammunition for manpower, by creating systems that let officers make decisions from a distance and men execute them without fully witnessing the consequences, the American approach to firepower allowed soldiers to retain a kind of moral continuity with their civilian selves. A young man from Iowa could come home and still believe himself to be essentially a good person, even though the system he had served had killed tens of thousands. The doctrine didn't eliminate moral weight. It distributed it so widely across so many people and machines that no single person had to carry the full burden of it. In the letters home, you can hear men grappling with this, sometimes explicitly and sometimes without quite knowing it. They are trying to explain what they have done, and in explaining it, they are trying to make sense of how they have contributed to something so terrible while remaining, in their own minds, essentially decent. The doctrine had given them the tools to do this: the mathematics, the distance, the machinery, the sense of protecting comrades. Whether this made them complicit in something immoral, or whether it saved them from becoming psychologically destroyed by the reality of modern war, remains a question each reader must sit with alone. The letters fade into silence eventually, like all things do, but what they left behind is a record of how human beings adapt to inhuman circumstances, how they find meaning and even dignity in systems designed for destruction, and how the doctrine of firepower had woven itself so deeply into the texture of American military culture that it became almost invisible, just the way war was conducted, the way one protected one's comrades, the way one tried to go home to one's family at the end of it all. Yet across the Pacific, the doctrine wore a different face entirely. The ocean itself became the primary weapon, and the mathematics of fire took on a rhythm shaped by vast distances, island fortifications, and the peculiar geometry of amphibious assault. Where European operations had built their firepower philosophy around coordinated land-based artillery and air support working in concert over relatively compact distances, the Pacific theater demanded something altogether different. The distances were immense. Islands lay scattered across hundreds of miles of water. The approach had to be methodical, deliberate, and utterly dependent on naval power projecting force from far beyond the horizon. When American forces approached an island stronghold, they often did not know precisely what waited for them in the interior, what caves honeycombed the coral ridges, what gun positions the Japanese had carved into the living rock. And so the doctrine adapted itself to this uncertainty. Instead of the fire direction center coordinating artillery fire across a European battlefield, it was now the Navy's gunnery officers aboard heavy cruisers and battleships, calculating range and deflection to rain shells down on distant beaches and inland positions. Imagine the peculiar geometry involved. A battleship's main battery, those massive 16-inch guns, could fire from 10 miles offshore. A single volley from a battleship could reshape terrain, collapse fortifications, reduce a presumed defensive strongpoint to rubble before the first American foot ever touched the beach. This was not precision, not in the modern sense. This was overwhelming force applied at distance. and it reflected the same underlying philosophy that had evolved in Europe, just translated into the language of sea power. The substitution began long before the infantry assault. Days, sometimes weeks before troops would land, naval bombardment would commence. Ships would pound the island. Spotting planes would circle overhead, calling back corrections to gunnery officers deep within steel hulls. The shells would arrive, massive and terrifying, and the defending Japanese would hunker deeper in their caves and bunkers, waiting for the inevitable cessation, knowing that the shelling meant the assault was coming soon. And then, in the days immediately before the landing, came the air component. Fighter bombers would sweep across the islands, strafing suspected positions, dropping their ordnance on beaches and ridgelines. The rhythm was relentless. Shells, then aircraft, then silence, then shells again. The idea was simple, though its execution was enormously complex. Damage the enemy, suppress their fire, force them to keep their heads down, to remain in their fortifications, unable to concentrate fire on the exposed beaches where men in landing craft would be most vulnerable. Could we say that the island campaigns were designed entirely around avoiding another Tarawa, that dreadful beach where Marines had waded through shallow water under concentrated Japanese fire, suffering tremendous casualties? Perhaps that is too neat a summary, but there was certainly a determination, born partly from that horror, that such slaughter would not be repeated, not if firepower could prevent it. The doctrine held that it could. It held that if you prepared the ground sufficiently, if you suppressed the defender thoroughly enough, if you committed enough steel and explosives before asking the infantrymen to advance, the casualties could be reduced. The results seemed to validate this thinking, though the moral calculus was always strange. You traded lives for tonnage, as the saying went, but the tonnage was not evenly distributed. The Japanese defenders, isolated and often without air support or naval reinforcement, bore the full weight of the bombardment. They could not respond in kind. They could only endure and prepare for the ground assault. The American soldiers, by contrast, approached under cover of that tremendous firepower. Yes, they still died. Assaults on fortified islands were costly, but they died in numbers substantially lower than might have occurred without the preparation, without the hours of naval gunfire and airstrikes that had theoretically degraded the enemy's ability to resist. The island of Iwo Jima offers perhaps the clearest example of this doctrine in its fullest expression. The bombardment there lasted for days. Every gun on every ship in the fleet seemed concentrated on that small volcanic island. Yet when the Marines landed, they discovered that the Japanese defenses remained largely intact. The underground bunkers, the caves, the interconnected defensive positions had survived the onslaught, and the landing became a grinding, terrible ordeal despite all the firepower that had preceded it. Does this not suggest something about the limits of the doctrine? Perhaps. Or perhaps it suggests that the firepower doctrine was never truly sufficient by itself, that it always required the infantrymen to complete what the guns had begun, and that the paradox was always present, always unresolved. In the Philippines, the situation was different again. The archipelago offered different terrain, a different strategic context. Luzon's dense interior, its mountains and jungles, could not be simply bombarded into submission. Operations there required more infantry maneuver, more ground-bound movement. Yet even there, the doctrine held. American artillery, mobilized from beach to beach, provided continuous support. Air power remained overhead, controlling the skies. The number of American casualties, relative to the scope of the campaign and the size of the forces engaged, remained proportionally lower than comparable operations in other theaters. The doctrine was working, in its way, at least as measured by the metrics that had always mattered most to its architects, the proportion of American lives preserved. In the final island campaigns, on Okinawa most notably, the doctrine reached perhaps its most developed form. Here, the Japanese had prepared extensive defenses across difficult terrain. Here, the bombardment lasted for weeks, one of the longest and most intense naval gun preparations of the entire war. Thousands of shells fell on that island before the first assault began. When the fighting did commence, it was bitter and grinding, a slow attritional struggle, quite unlike the idealized version of the doctrine, where overwhelming firepower would collapse resistance quickly. Yet even here, the preparation mattered. The initial Japanese counteroffensive, launched before the American bombardment had fully accomplished its purpose, was blunted almost immediately. The defending artillery and air support that the Japanese hoped to employ had been substantially degraded. The American forces, moving cautiously through that shattered landscape, suffered far fewer casualties than they might have in an assault on a fully prepared and intact defensive position. The Pacific Doctrine, then, was not so much a different doctrine as it was the European doctrine, adapted to different circumstances. The principles remained the same. Substitute firepower for manpower. Let machines bear the risk. Let guns and aircraft do the work, before asking men to close on a fortified position. The scale was different, the medium was different, the distances were measured in ocean instead of open field, but the underlying conviction, the faith that technology could reduce the cost in human life, that conviction remained constant across all the wide oceans and all the island shores where Americans fought. Behind every thundering salvo that rewrote the map of Europe, there moved a quieter machinery altogether, not of metal and fire, but of pencils and paper, of careful men hunched over desks in canvas tents, their fingers stained with graphite and sweat. These were the architects of firepower itself, the mathematicians and engineers whose calculations, rendered in columns and coordinates, became the difference between a soldier coming home or being carried home in silence. In the early morning hours of planning, long before dawn broke over any battlefield, these men would gather in command posts that smelled of coffee and canvas. They moved slide rules across printed tables with the precision of surgeons. They spoke in degrees and distances, in angles of fire and time-on-target calculations, translating the intentions of generals into the language that guns could understand. Their work was almost meditative in its precision, each number a life preserved, though they rarely thought of it that way. They simply thought, how can we make this shot count? How can we concentrate firepower at the exact moment and place where it matters most? The Fire Direction Center was their kingdom, though it was usually a modest place, sometimes just a truck with a canvas roof, sometimes a reinforced dugout with a field telephone switchboard and a few oak tables. The men who worked there came from all walks of American life. Some had been surveyors before the war. Others were railroad engineers who understood the geometry of networks. A few were fresh from universities, mathematicians who had answered their country's call and found themselves translating abstract theory into the concrete business of directing artillery. They were not famous. No one composed songs about them. Their names would never appear in official histories or in the letters soldiers wrote home to their families. Yet their influence radiated outward like an invisible web across every gun position from the Atlantic to the Rhine. Picture, if you will, the moment when a forward observer, the eyes of artillery, the man in the most dangerous position, crouched in frozen mud or scorching sand with only a radio and binoculars, spots movement. Enemy troops gathering, tanks massing, a command post identifiable only by patterns and smoke. He picks up his radio and speaks a single phrase, a grid reference, a description. Back in that canvas-roofed center, miles behind the lines, that information arrives like a spark striking kindling. What happens next is a dance of numbers. The fire direction officer receives the coordinates. Around him, his men spring into motion with the synchronized rhythm of people who have practiced this same sequence hundreds of times. One man checks the map. Another consults the firing tables, those magnificent books of calculated trajectories based on powder charge, shell weight, barrel wear, wind, temperature, air pressure. A third adjusts for the specific characteristics of the gun, because each gun, even guns of identical manufacture, shoots slightly differently, and these men knew their guns the way a musician knows an instrument. They would call back to the guns themselves, elevation here, traverse there, fuse setting for this particular target. And from multiple gun positions spread across the countryside, sometimes separated by miles, each crew would make their adjustments. Then, on the signal of the fire direction officer, a voice through a telephone, calm and certain, they would fire. Not in sequence, but coordinated so precisely that shells from different guns, launched from different positions, traveling different distances through the air, would arrive at the target almost simultaneously. The effect was transformative. Instead of artillery as a scattered, somewhat random force, guns doing their best to help, but never quite coordinated, you had artillery as a focused instrument of will, a concentrated hammer blow that could shatter infantry formations, suppress enemy guns, buy precious seconds for the infantry to move forward. And the mathematics that made this possible came from the careful, almost invisible work of men who rarely saw the impact of their calculations. One cannot overstate how revolutionary this truly was, though it may seem obvious now, in an age of computers and digital coordination. But in the 1940s, doing this mathematics under pressure, in darkness or chaos, with radio operators reading coordinates and men's lives hanging on decimal points of accuracy, this required a particular kind of mind. These men had to hold multiple systems in their heads simultaneously. They had to work quickly without panic. They had to understand that a small error in their figures might mean the difference between support fire and friendly fire, between brilliant success and disaster. The engineers and mathematicians who designed these fire direction centers understood something almost philosophical about what they were trying to achieve. They believed, and they were largely correct, that coordination and concentration could substitute for mass. By making every shell count more, you needed fewer shells. By making every gun more effective through synchronized fire, you needed fewer guns. And that meant that more guns could be devoted to other purposes, and that more men could be kept out of the direct line of fire altogether. There was a particular category of these unseen architects who deserve special mention, for their work was almost mystical in its specificity. These were the ballistic specialists, the men who understood the aerodynamics of shells in flight, who could calculate how atmospheric conditions, humidity, barometric pressure, even the temperature of the powder charge, would affect a projectile's trajectory. The Americans invested heavily in such expertise. They trained men to be weather observers, to take precise readings from remote gun positions, and to relay that data back to the fire direction centers where it would be woven into the calculations. Why such precision? Why lavish such attention on factors that might seem infinitesimal? Because precision kills efficiently, and in the calculus of war, efficiency is compassion. If a single shell, launched with absolute accuracy, achieves what might otherwise require 10 shells from less sophisticated positions, then 9 soldiers don't have to be there. 9 soldiers don't have to breathe dust and fear. 9 soldiers don't have to watch their friends fall. They get to go home, get to hold their children, get to live the lives that machines and mathematics bought for them with borrowed time. These engineers understood this intuitively, even if they didn't say it aloud. They worked with the intensity of people who grasped that their calculations were not abstract. Every time they refined a fire direction procedure, every time they improved coordination between guns, Every time they reduced the uncertainty in their firing tables, they were casting a vote for American lives. They were saying, with every precise number, "We would rather that machines pay the cost of this war than men." The slide rule became, in a sense, a moral instrument. So too the mimeographed firing table, the grid coordinate, the voice on the radio giving coordinates to unseen guns. These were tools of mercy wrapped in the language of physics and mathematics, and the men who wielded them understood, perhaps not always consciously, that they were engaged in something more important than the mere technical business of directing fire. It is possible that no one in the entire American military establishment had a greater impact, gun for gun, on preserving American lives than these quiet mathematicians and engineers. Yet they received no medals, no citations, no official recognition in most cases. They would return home after the war to unremarkable lives, to engineering firms, to university positions, to quiet suburban homes where their children would have no idea what their fathers had really done in the darkness, calculating angles of fire under pressure, knowing that thousands of lives depended on their precision. The war would move on. The campaigns would march across continents and through history. Generals would be remembered. Infantry officers would be celebrated. But these men would fade into the background, their greatest achievement being precisely that their work was so successful that it became invisible. No one saw them, no one knew their names, but their mathematics lived on in every American soldier who came home instead of dying in some foreign field, and that is perhaps the greatest legacy any engineer could hope for. And yet, there is something profoundly strange about what American gunners had built, something that whispers at the edge of every calculation, every perfectly coordinated barrage, every moment when the sky opened and the earth trembled. The doctrine had been born from mercy, from a deliberate rejection of waste, from officers who had watched brothers die in trenches and asked themselves a single question: what if we sent metal instead? What if we sent fire? And they had answered that question with mathematics and industry, with production figures and supply trains, with every innovation of the 20th century bent toward a single purpose: to break the enemy's will and break his body before our own soldiers had to look him in the eye. But firepower, once unleashed, does not distinguish between the abstract and the human. A shell cannot read intentions. It cannot know whether it was fired to spare lives or to take them. And so, as American artillery men and forward observers moved deeper into Europe, through cities that had been reduced to rubble, and across fields where entire villages had been erased from existence, many of them began to feel the weight of an unresolved paradox. We are trying to save lives by ending others. We are committing an act of mercy through an act of destruction. How do you hold both truths at once? Consider the young artillery lieutenant standing in an observation post outside of a French town in 1944, binoculars pressed to his eyes, radio headset around his neck. He has been trained to see the landscape as a grid, a calculation, a problem to be solved with fire. He spots enemy positions in a church steeple, in the rubble of a school, in the windows of what might have been a hospital. He radios the coordinates back to the fire direction center, and within seconds, or minutes, shells begin to fall on that town. The buildings collapse, dust rises, silence follows, punctuated only by secondary explosions and the sound of stone settling. He has just saved the lives of perhaps 50 or 100 infantrymen who would otherwise have had to cross that open ground, would have had to take that town house by house, would have faced machine gun fire and grenades and the terrible mathematics of close combat. He has done exactly what he was trained to do, what the doctrine demanded of him, and yet he cannot unsee what he saw through the binoculars. He cannot unknow that there were people in that town, civilians perhaps, soldiers who had mothers, a steeple that rang bells once. a school where children had learned to read. This is the moral weight that sits, unspoken, inside every account of the doctrine's success. It is the thing that no training manual addressed, no tactical lecture explored, no after-action report quite captured. The doctrine had been designed to be humane in its intentions and technological in its execution, but the gap between those two things is wider than any ocean, deeper than any calculation. To send a 10-ton shell through the air in place of a young man is arguably an act of wisdom, but it is also an act of obliteration. It is both at once, always, and there is no mathematical formula that can reconcile that contradiction. Some historians have argued that the American embrace of firepower doctrine was not simply a practical choice, but a reflection of something deeper in the national character. A culture that had always valued machines over men, industry over agriculture, efficiency over tradition, naturally gravitated toward a way of war that substituted technology for sacrifice, perhaps. Or perhaps it was simply that the Americans had the industrial capacity to do it, and once they did, the moral calculus became almost invisible. If you can spare lives through firepower, and you have the firepower to spare, then doesn't virtue demand that you do it? The gunners and observers who lived through it rarely framed it this way in their letters home. They spoke instead of the practical realities, the cold, the fear, the fatigue, the strange bonds that formed between men who depended on each other for survival. They spoke of the moment when the barrage lifted and the infantry could advance without being shot at. They spoke of friends who came back alive because of what they did, and that was enough. The moral philosophy of the doctrine was something the generals thought about, if they thought about it at all. The men in the mud simply knew that when they called in fire, their friends had a better chance of going home. And yet, in the quiet moments, and there were quiet moments, even in war, many of them must have wondered about the other side of the equation. They had been taught that their job was to minimize American casualties, and they had done it superbly. But what about the casualties they created? What about the German and Italian soldiers who were caught in those barrages, who were not given the choice of advancing or retreating but simply ceased to exist in an instant of fire and light? What about the civilians who happened to be nearby, in the wrong town at the wrong moment, simply living their lives until American shells taught them that geography was destiny? The doctrine itself had no answer to these questions. It had been built on a premise that was morally sound, spare your own people. But that premise led inexorably to conclusions that no one quite wanted to look at directly. To consistently choose firepower over manpower meant to gradually shift the burden of warfare away from the combatants and toward everyone else. It meant that the question was not, how do we minimize casualties, but rather, whose casualties will we minimize? And the answer, always, was ours. The answer was Americans first, and everyone else was a variable in the equation, a cost to be calculated but not prioritized. Some of the men who orchestrated this doctrine in its final forms seemed to understand this, at least dimly. In interviews conducted after the war, some of the artillery commanders would speak, carefully and rarely, about the strange feeling of having engineered a system so efficient at destruction that it took on a kind of terrible beauty. They would describe watching a perfect concentration of fire, 10 or 15 minutes of non-stop bombardment that covered an area the size of a small town, and feeling something like awe mixed with revulsion. They had created something that worked magnificently, and that they never wanted to use again. And perhaps this is the deepest moral truth embedded in the doctrine itself, that it revealed, more clearly than any other system of warfare, the truth that war is not a puzzle to be solved, but a tragedy to be endured. The Americans had tried to make war rational, technological, merciful. They had tried to strip it of its human randomness and replace it with calculation, and they had succeeded in many ways. Fewer American soldiers died per enemy killed, than in almost any other conflict in history. The mathematics worked, the doctrine delivered on its promise. But in doing so, it had forced the entire world to live inside that same calculation, to understand war as a problem of logistics, and logistics as a problem of mathematics, and mathematics as something that could be made humane if only you arranged the numbers correctly. The gunners knew better. They lived inside the paradox every day. They sent fire that they knew would save their friends, and they could not help but think about the other men on the receiving end of those calculations, the ones whose coordinates had been plotted on a map and fed into a fire direction center and converted into death. They had been asked to be both merciful and merciless, both compassionate and efficient, and they had done what they were asked. But the weight of that impossible choice never quite left them, even when the war ended and the guns fell silent. The war ended not with the silence everyone expected, but with the fading of one roar and the gathering of another. In the months after the German surrender, and then Japan's capitulation, American officers found themselves in an unusual position, one that their predecessors would never have imagined possible. They had won. The doctrine had held. The shells had spoken where bullets might have, and the nation had emerged not just victorious, but with something precious still intact, a reservoir of young men who would come home to build, to marry, to start families. And in those first strange years of peace, a question began to form quietly in the minds of strategists and commanders, the kind of question that shapes decades before anyone fully realizes it has been asked. If firepower could preserve lives in the greatest war humanity had yet fought, what might it do in the tensions that were already beginning to crack the alliance that had defeated fascism? The world that emerged from the ashes of 1945 was not, as many had hoped, a world without enemies. It was, in fact, a world increasingly divided by ideology, by competing visions of how humanity should organize itself. The Soviet Union, which had bled perhaps 25 million souls in the struggle against Nazi Germany, now looked westward with suspicion and hunger. America, which had learned to win by exchanging steel for blood, now faced an adversary whose own losses seemed only to harden its resolve. And in this new confrontation, not quite war, but far more than peace, the American doctrine of firepower found itself being re-examined, reinterpreted, and ultimately reinforced in ways that would shape the next 50 years of strategic thought. The architects of American Cold War strategy, many of them the same men who had orchestrated the vast bombardment campaigns of the Second World War, began to ask a new kind of question. In a world where nuclear weapons now existed, where the prospect of total annihilation had entered into the realm of possibility, how could the old logic of preserving lives still apply? The answer they arrived at was, in many ways, an extrapolation of what they already believed. If conventional firepower could spare infantrymen from the worst horrors of combat, then overwhelming strategic power, the kind that existed in atomic arsenals, might prevent war itself. The doctrine of massed fire, which had been about using technology and abundance to minimize casualties, began to evolve into something broader and more abstract. It became a doctrine of deterrence, the idea that such overwhelming destructive capacity, so precisely balanced and so carefully controlled, could exist as a shield against aggression without ever being used. Think of it as a strange and delicate transformation. The men who had spent years calculating the precise coordinates for artillery barrages, who had learned to think in terms of fire direction centers and coordinated attacks, now found themselves thinking in terms of missile silos and nuclear submarines circling beneath the oceans. The principle, however, remained surprisingly consistent. Abundance, precision, the substitution of machines and materials for the lives of soldiers. And perhaps most importantly, the assumption that American industrial capacity, that endless fountain of manufactured power that had seemed limitless during the war, would remain limitless in the years to come. In 1949, when the Soviet Union tested its first atomic weapon, 5 years ahead of most American estimates, there was a moment of genuine shock in the corridors of power. But the response, when it came, was almost reflexive. It was the same response that had guided American strategy throughout the war. Build more, build better, build in such overwhelming quantity that no adversary could match or overcome what America possessed. The Strategic Air Command, which would become perhaps the most terrifying instrument of destruction ever assembled, was built on the principle of nuclear abundance. So many bombers, so many nuclear weapons, distributed across so many bases that no conceivable first strike could eliminate the American capacity to retaliate. The doctrine of massed fire had ascended into the nuclear realm. And yet, even as the atomic age dawned, conventional military thinkers were drawing different lessons from the Second World War. In Europe, as NATO took shape in the early 1950s, American military planners began to think carefully about how to defend a continent that was, in many ways, the object of Soviet ambition. The numbers were troubling. The Soviet Union, which had emerged from the war with a vast standing army, had millions of troops. Western Europe, weakened and impoverished, could not match Soviet manpower. How, then, could NATO hope to defend itself? The answer, unsurprisingly, came from the doctrine that had already proven its worth. Let the Soviets bring men, NATO would bring firepower. The cornerstone of NATO's strategy, the document that guided everything from force deployment to training doctrine, rested on an idea that would have been familiar to the architects of the American artillery revolution of the 1930s and 1940s. A relatively smaller force, equipped with superior firepower and supported by advanced technology, could hold against a numerically superior adversary. Artillery would be distributed throughout NATO forces in unprecedented density. Tanks, which had evolved considerably since the end of the war, would provide mobile firepower, and crucially, tactical nuclear weapons would be embedded into the strategic calculus, another form of abundance, another way of saying that firepower could substitute for manpower. This thinking persisted, with variations and refinements, for decades. Throughout the Cold War, American military doctrine, whether in Europe, in Korea after 1950, or in the contingency plans for dozens of potential theaters of conflict, rested on the assumption that American technological superiority and industrial abundance could overcome whatever numerical disadvantages American forces might face. The Fire Direction Center had evolved into something called the Air-Land Battle Doctrine, later refined into network-centric warfare. The names changed, the technologies transformed almost beyond recognition, but the underlying principle remained constant. Do not, if possible, meet the enemy with equal masses of men. Instead, concentrate firepower with such precision and such overwhelming force that the enemy's ability to fight is broken before close combat is engaged. The precision part deserves particular attention, for it represents a crucial evolution of the wartime doctrine. During the Second World War, American artillery, for all its sophistication, still operated within certain limitations. It killed in areas, in swaths. As technology advanced, first with improved aiming mechanisms, then with radar, then with computers, and finally with satellites and digital networks, the ability to deliver firepower with increasing precision became one of the holy grails of military development. It is a curious irony that the more precise the weapons became, the more they seemed to embody the original intention of the doctrine, which is what? To spare the lives of your own soldiers by ensuring that the destructive power you unleash reaches only its intended target, without the collateral spreading that had characterized earlier bombardment campaigns. By the 1980s and 1990s, as the Cold War gradually wound down and the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, American military doctrine had been thoroughly transformed by the technological revolution that had begun almost immediately after 1945. But the philosophy remained unmistakably descended from what had been learned in those years. When American forces entered the Persian Gulf in 1991, what the world witnessed was not a war of attrition, not a grinding struggle of manpower against manpower, but rather a display of firepower so precise, so overwhelming, and so carefully choreographed that it seemed almost unreal to those who watched from a distance. Stealth aircraft that could not be seen delivering precision-guided munitions, cruise missiles fired from ships hundreds of miles away, traveling down streets in distant cities, artillery strikes that seemed less like bombardment and more like surgery. The doctrine had matured. The lesson learned in the Louisiana maneuvers 70 years earlier had propagated forward, been refined, integrated with technologies that the visionary artillery officers of the 1930s could never have imagined. But what does it mean that this doctrine, born from a specific set of historical circumstances and a particular set of strategic challenges, has become almost unquestioned in American military thinking? There is something worth pondering in the way that military doctrines, once formed, seem to acquire a kind of permanence. The Cold War has ended. The Soviet Union no longer exists. The scenarios for which NATO was built, vast armored armies pouring across the North German plain, seem like relics of a vanished world, and yet the basic assumption persists. When America wages war, it wages it with technology and firepower. It tries, in however imperfect a way, to substitute machines for men. It seeks precision over carpet bombing, efficiency over attrition. Whether this approach is morally superior to its alternatives, whether it genuinely saves lives in the way its architects hoped, whether it sometimes creates its own peculiar horrors, these are questions that seem to recede further into the background with each passing year. What is clear, however, is that the world that America created after 1945, the military-industrial apparatus that it assembled to wage and then deter war, remains fundamentally shaped by the lessons learned in those 5 years of total conflict. The doctrine lives on, in the training programs for young officers, in the procurement decisions that determine which weapons get built and which do not, in the strategic concepts that guide how America thinks about its role in the world. The choice made in those years, to build machines and spend ammunition rather than spend lives, proved so effective, so enduring, that it has become almost invisible. It is simply how America wages war now, and perhaps that is the doctrine's final triumph. Not that it was right or wrong, but that it became so thoroughly embedded in American military culture, so thoroughly justified by technological success, that it ceased to be a choice at all, and became instead a kind of default assumption. In the way a person's choices reveal their values more honestly than their words ever could, so too does a nation's military doctrine expose something intimate about what it truly believes in, what it fears, and what it is willing to sacrifice to defend itself. The doctrine that emerged from American arsenals and firing positions across 5 continents was not simply a technical arrangement of shells and trajectories, though it was certainly that. It was, perhaps without anyone fully articulating it at the time, a statement about how America chose to wage war when the stakes became absolute, when survival hung in the balance, and every decision multiplied outward into consequences measured in lives and nations. Consider what it meant, in the deepest sense, that American commanders and strategists chose to pour hundreds of millions of tons of steel into the earth, rather than send their soldiers into certain slaughter. It meant that somewhere in the American conscience, shaped by frontier abundance and industrial confidence, there lived a peculiar kind of mercy. Not the mercy of sparing an enemy, but something perhaps more revealing than that. The mercy of assuming your own soldiers had infinite value, that their lives could not be bartered away, could not be spent like currency in some grim calculus of ground gained and objectives taken. That the proper role of a nation at war was not to find ever more men to feed into the grinding machine, but to find ever better ways to make machines grind instead. The philosophy was paradoxical in ways that might not be immediately apparent in the darkness and quiet of reflection. To save lives, the doctrine demanded the creation of more death-making capacity than had perhaps ever existed in human history up to that moment. To protect the infantryman, it required an infrastructure of supply, production, and distribution that stretched across entire continents and oceans. To spare the individual soldier, it demanded that millions of workers, from copper miners in Montana to factory hands in Detroit, to merchant marine sailors crossing the Atlantic in constant danger, contribute their labor and their own risk to the vast apparatus of ammunition manufacture and delivery. The doctrine did not erase human sacrifice. It redistributed it, moved it backward along the supply chains, diffused it through the civilian economy, transformed it from the concentrated horror of the front line into the grinding, less visible exhaustion of total industrial war. Yet perhaps there was something in this redistribution itself that spoke to American values more plainly than any military manifesto could have done. The implicit statement was this: better that machines should bear the weight of destruction than men. Better that furnaces should burn with the heat of production than that young men's bodies should burn in the summer heat of enemy fire. Better that the nation should exhaust its material wealth than exhaust its human future. There is a kind of humanism embedded in that preference, however strange it might seem when expressed so plainly. It rests on the assumption that resources, however vast and precious, are ultimately renewable and replaceable in ways that human lives, with all their potentiality and particularity, are not. The Americans who built this doctrine, the artillery officers sketching fire direction calculations, the factory managers coordinating 8-hour shifts, the logistics planners trying to ensure that shells arrived at forward depots faster than guns could fire them. They were not consciously philosophers. Most of them were practical men solving immediate problems, and yet their cumulative decisions, made thousands of times over years of industrial and military mobilization, formed a kind of unwritten constitution about what American warfare would look like when the hour demanded it. It would be loud, it would be vast, it would be methodical, and it would exhaust resources at a scale that only a nation of continental abundance could even imagine sustaining. But was the doctrine truly, as some have suggested, a form of humanitarian restraint dressed in steel and explosives, or was it something more complicated than that? One might wonder, in the thoughtful silence of late-night reflection, whether the choice to wage firepower-intensive war was entirely driven by a desire to spare American lives. Might it not also have been driven by confidence in American industrial capacity, by faith in the nation's ability to outproduce any enemy, by a strategic calculus that said the United States could afford to waste ammunition but could not afford to waste soldiers, because the wars of the future would require a strong and intact American population to win them afterward? Both things could be true simultaneously. Mercy and self-interest are not always opposites. A nation can save its soldiers' lives partly out of genuine regard for their welfare and partly out of recognition that those soldiers would be needed later, in the Cold War that was already taking shape in the minds of strategists, even as the last battles of the Second World War were being fought. The doctrine whispered something else too, something about how America imagined technological progress and its relationship to human suffering. In the American mind, perhaps more than in the minds of other industrial powers, there lived a deep belief that machines could substitute for human pain, that engineering could be a form of compassion, that if you could only build the right apparatus, the right system, you could reduce the cost in human terms. This was, in some sense, the inheritance of a nation that had built itself through rapid technological adoption, that had automated its agriculture and its manufacture, that had always believed that the next innovation would ease the burden on the human body and spirit. In extending this logic to warfare, American military planners were simply asking the same question they asked in factories and farms. Could technology make this terrible thing less terrible? Could machines absorb the punishment instead of men? There is an ache in the honesty of that question, and in the millions of tons of steel that were the answer to it. Because the doctrine ultimately did save American lives. That part is verifiable in statistics, in the ratio of Americans who survived the war to Americans who fell, a ratio that was far better than it might have been had the tactics of the First World War been faithfully replicated. And yet the total human cost of the war, the destruction of cities and the displacement of millions, and the scars that would take generations to heal, those costs were not reduced. They were, if anything, magnified. The doctrine's success at protecting American lives did not make war less terrible overall. It made American war-making more efficient, more overwhelming, more capable of sustaining total destruction across wider theaters of operation. In choosing to spare its soldiers through the application of technology and industry, America also chose to make itself capable of delivering unprecedented amounts of violent force, and that capability would reshape world politics for decades to come. Perhaps this is what the doctrine truly reveals about American values, if one sits with the idea long enough in the quiet hours when such reflections come more naturally. It reveals a nation that believed in its own productive capacity almost as deeply as it believed in God. A nation that assumed abundance rather than scarcity as its natural condition, and therefore could afford to use material resources lavishly in place of human ones. A nation that was, at its foundation, optimistic about technology's ability to solve human problems, even when the human problem was how to wage war in a way that did not destroy the nation waging it. And perhaps most telling of all, it reveals a nation that, when faced with an existential threat, chose to respond not by abandoning its character, but by amplifying it, by becoming more thoroughly itself, by leaning deeper into the very characteristics that had allowed it to develop such industrial and technological capacity in the first place. The doctrine was never written down in those terms. It emerged from thousands of decisions, from conversations in quiet offices, from mathematical problems solved on slide rules and on blackboards, from the lived experience of soldiers and gunners who learned through trial and error what worked and what did not. And in the end, it became less an explicit philosophy and more a way of war, a way of thinking about problems and solving them that would outlast the particular conflict that had given it birth, that would shape how America thought about military power for generations to come. Technology as compassion, industry as mercy, the transformation of resources into survival. These were not ideals anyone had set out to achieve. They were simply what emerged when a rich, technologically sophisticated nation found itself in a war for survival and applied all of its capacities toward winning that war while preserving itself for the future that would follow. The landscape, after the silence came, changed in ways that had nothing to do with maps or orders, where artillery had torn the earth into geometry, those concentric scars that radiated outward from impact points, each one a mathematical proof of distance and force. The grass began its quiet return. It did not happen overnight. Nothing that heals ever does. But in the months and years that followed the final gun's retreat from the fields of Europe, something patient and green found its way back into the wounded places, as if the earth itself possessed a memory older than the war, and was determined to reclaim what had briefly been taken. The firing positions themselves, those carefully surveyed strips of ground where men had stood for hours and days and weeks, watching through telescopes and speaking into radios, slowly lost their definition. The grass grew back thicker in some places than others. where ammunition had been stacked in neat pyramids. Weather and time dissolved the geometric order into shadow and randomness. The gun pits, those shallow depressions where so much concentrated effort and calculation had occurred, became simply uneven ground again, indistinguishable from the rest of the field to anyone who had not been there. Consider the silence that settled into those places. It was not the silence of emptiness, but rather the silence of work completed. The great machinery of coordinated firepower, which had required so much attention and so much will to sustain, gradually powered down. The men who had spent years mastering the slide rules and the radio frequencies and the ballistic tables moved on to other work, or they did not move at all, and were remembered by those who remained. The guns themselves were collected, catalogued, stored in distant warehouses, or melted down into other forms. Some found their way into memorials, their barrels pointing toward the sky in eternal salute. Others simply disappeared into the vast industrial apparatus of a peacetime nation, stripped of their purpose, transformed into something else. The forward observers, those men who had crawled into dangerous places to call down fire with precision, returned to ordinary light. They went home to farms and cities and small towns. They learned to look at landscapes again without calculating ranges and trajectories. Some of them found that this ordinary vision was harder to recover than they had imagined. The habit of seeing ground as terrain, as a series of problems to be solved with mathematics and metal, did not leave them immediately.